Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. There is a man in this story who spent 30 years outside the country he was trying to liberate. He learned to cook in London, retouched photographs in Paris, studied revolutionary theory in Moscow, trained guerrillas in Canton, wrote poetry in a Chinese prison, and lived under at least 7 different names before most of the world had ever heard any of them. By the time he finally mattered to the newspapers, he was already in his 50s, and the most important work was behind him. He was born in a province so poor and so historically ungovernable that the French colonial administration had a specific file on it. He died before the war that bears his legacy was over, and yet the two most powerful military establishments of the 20th century, one that had just defeated Nazi Germany, one that had developed the atomic bomb, both came to Southeast Asia, both committed their full strategic weight, and both eventually left. He did not. This is the story of how that happened. If this kind of history is what you come here for, subscribing keeps it coming. New episodes arrive every week, and a like helps others find their way here too. What follows traces the arc of one life from a village in Yunnan province in the late 19th century to a square in Saigon in 1975. From a young man stepping onto a French steamer with almost nothing to the moment a tank breached the gates of a presidential palace in a city that had once been the capital of an American-backed nation. It is a long arc. It is worth following slowly. The chronicle begins in the narrow waste of Vietnam, where the mountains press close to the sea. Chapter 1. The province that bred trouble. Nghệ An is not an easy place. It sits in the narrow middle of Vietnam, where the country pinches down to its thinnest point, the Trong Son Mountains pressing in from the west and the South China Sea holding the eastern edge. The soil is thin, the summers are brutally hot, and the rains when they come arrive in volumes that flood the lowland fields rather than nourish them. The people of Nghệ An had been farming this difficult land for centuries before the French arrived, and they had developed, across those centuries, a reputation that administrators of every stripe, Chinese imperial, Vietnamese dynastic, and eventually French colonial, found consistently inconvenient. They were known for producing scholars, for producing rebels, and for treating those two categories as less distinct than most governing authorities would prefer. Into this province, in 1890, a boy was born who would eventually be known by more names than almost any political figure of the 20th century. He was registered at birth as Nguyen Sin Kung. His father called him Tat Than. He would later take the name Woon I Quoc, Woon the Patriot, as a political identity, and later still the name by which history knows him, Ho Chi Minh, which translates with a kind of deliberate plainness as he who enlightens. The multiplicity of names was not vanity. It was a survival strategy that he developed young and practiced for the rest of his life. The habit of a man who understood from an early age that visibility was dangerous. His father, Nguyen Sin Sac, was the son of a farmer who had managed, through considerable personal discipline and apparent native brilliance, to pass the Mandarin examinations, the classical Confucian tests that were Vietnam's primary mechanism of social mobility for centuries, and that the French colonial administration had already begun to hollow out from within. Sac passed at a high level. He received appointments. He served in the imperial bureaucracy at Hue for several years before his growing resentment of French oversight and his own erratic temperament made the position untenable. He is described in surviving accounts as a man of genuine intellectual distinction and considerable personal difficulty, someone who drank more than was useful and argued more than was politic, but who read widely, thought seriously, and instilled in his children an understanding that the world they had inherited was not the world as it should be. The world they had inherited was French Indochina, and French Indochina had been assembled through conquest across a period of roughly 30 years, beginning with the naval bombardment of Da Nang in 1858 and ending with the formal establishment of the Indo-Chinese Union in 1887, which gathered Cochinchina, Annam, Tonkin, Cambodia, and eventually Laos under a single French administrative structure. Governor-General Paul Doumer, who arrived in 1897 and spent 5 years reorganizing the colony's finances, transformed Indochina from a military project into an economic one. He built railways, constructed roads using Vietnamese corvée labor, the unpaid work obligation that Vietnamese subjects owed the colonial administration, and established 3 monopolies in opium, alcohol, and salt that together generated the majority of the colonial budget. The opium monopoly alone, by the early 20th century, was accounting for roughly a third of the colony's total revenue. What this meant at the level of a Nghệ An village was not abstract. The corvée requirement pulled men away from their fields during planting and harvest seasons. The salt monopoly raised the price of a substance that Vietnamese households needed for food preservation. The restructuring of land tenure in Cochinchina, the rice-producing South, concentrated landholding among a small class of large proprietors and French settlers, while reducing the majority of rural Vietnamese to tenancy. The gap between what rice sold for on the export market and what a Vietnamese laborer earned picking it was, by most contemporary accounts, substantial enough to make the math of ordinary life consistently unworkable. These are not conditions that produce political quietism. Nguyen Sinh Sac understood this with a clarity that his formal position in the colonial bureaucracy made uncomfortable. He sent his children to a school in Hue where the curriculum still included classical Chinese learning, the foundation of the old Mandarin system, but where the teachers talked about the world beyond Vietnam in terms that the French administration would not have approved. The young boy who would become Ho Chi Minh arrived in Hue around 1906, a teenager from a provincial family with a father whose career was already faltering, studying in an environment where the question of what had happened to Vietnam and what could be done about it was not an abstraction, but the organizing preoccupation of the most serious people he met. The most serious person he encountered in those years may not have been a teacher at all. Phan Boi Chau was by the early 1900s the most prominent Vietnamese nationalist figure of his generation, a scholar from Nghệ An, the same province, who had concluded that the traditional Confucian framework of Vietnamese resistance was exhausted, and that what Vietnam needed was a new model and a new patron. He found his model in Meiji Japan, which had modernized with sufficient speed to defeat Russia in 1905, and he spent years traveling between Hanoi, Tokyo, and various points of the Chinese exile community, writing appeals, organizing a movement he called Dong Du, Eastern Travel, which encouraged young Vietnamese to go to Japan for modern education and attempting to persuade the Japanese government to support Vietnamese independence from France. The Japanese, whose relationship with France was complicated by competing colonial interests, but ultimately more manageable than a confrontation would justify, declined. Fanboy Chow's time in Tokyo produced a document that tells you a great deal about the political imagination of the first generation of Vietnamese nationalists. He wrote a formal appeal to the Japanese emperor, composed in classical Chinese, drawing on the Confucian concept of shared Asian civilization as the basis for Japanese support of Vietnamese liberation. He had it printed, distributed it among the Vietnamese diaspora in Japan, and sent copies to sympathetic figures across East Asia. The Japanese government ignored it. The French colonial administration noted it and began the process of pressuring Japan to expel him. The document itself, earnest, classically framed, addressed to a foreign emperor who was never going to read it, represents the first version of a political strategy that a young man from Nghệ An would spend the next 40 years revising: the search for a great power willing to back Vietnamese independence. The failure of the Dong Du movement reached the students in Hue not as an official announcement, but as the gradual disappearance of the possibility it had represented. Shaw was eventually expelled from Japan in 1909, continued his organizing from China, was captured by French agents in Shanghai in 1925, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest in Hue. His trajectory was a lesson that could be read several ways. One reading was that working through foreign patrons was unreliable. Another was that the Confucian framework was simply too limited an instrument for the task. A third, which the young student in Hue seems to have absorbed most deeply, was that the specific error was in the choice of patron, that the right great power backer, approached with the right argument, might behave differently. In 1908, while still in Hue, the young Nguyen Tat Than witnessed something that appears in almost every account of his political formation. A large tax protest movement spread through central Vietnam, peasants marching on provincial capitals to demand relief from crushing fiscal obligations. The marches, organized loosely by local scholars and gentry who shared the general resentment of French extraction, without having any very clear plan for what to do about it. The French response was administrative and then military. Troops dispersed the marches. Arrests followed. Several of the organizing scholars were executed. The colonial administration made no adjustment to the tax structure. He was 17 or 18 at the time, watching from a city that was the seat of the Vietnamese imperial court, a court that had been reduced by French oversight to a ceremonial function, and that was, in any practical sense, incapable of protecting its own subjects. The combination of the tax protests and the colonial response seems to have produced in him not despair, but a kind of analytical coldness, an understanding that the existing frameworks for resistance, whether traditional Confucian petition, Japanese-backed modernization, or spontaneous peasant protest, were all insufficient against an opponent that controlled the military and the courts and the revenue and had no particular reason to negotiate with any of them. Around 1909, his father's position in the bureaucracy finally collapsed entirely, partly owing to Sachs' increasing difficulty with colonial oversight, partly to a specific incident involving his conduct as a local magistrate. Father and son separated. Nguyen Sinh Sak drifted south, eventually spending his later years practicing traditional medicine in the Mekong Delta. The son moved further south himself to a school in Phan Thiet, where he taught briefly, and then further still to Saigon. He was learning French, not as a mark of assimilation, but as a tool, the language of the administration he intended to understand as thoroughly as possible. In 1911, in Saigon, he found a way out of the country. He signed on as a kitchen worker on a French ocean liner, the Amiral Latouche Treville, under the name Ba. He was 21 years old. He had watched his country taxed, conscripted, administered, and suppressed for his entire life. He had watched two serious attempts at resistance fail, one through foreign patron strategy, one through direct popular action, and had found neither adequate. He had a father who had understood the problem clearly and had been broken by it. He had apparently drawn the conclusion that understanding the problem from inside Vietnam was insufficient, and that to find a method that worked, he would need to see the empire from its other end. He did not know, stepping onto that ship in the port of Saigon, that he would not return to Vietnam for 30 years. He did not know that the method he was looking for would take 2 decades to find, and another decade after that to be in a position to use. What he knew, or what the record suggests he knew, was that the available options had been tried and had failed, and that somewhere beyond the horizon there was a politics equal to the problem. He left to find it. The ship passed through Singapore, through Colombo, through the Suez Canal, and eventually into the Atlantic. It docked at Marseille. The young man from Nghệ An, who had grown up watching a colonial administration extract wealth from his country with the calm efficiency of a machine designed for precisely that purpose, stepped ashore in France, the metropole, the source, the center of the system he had spent his entire conscious life inside. He would spend the next decade studying it, arguing with it, and slowly finding in the reading rooms and political meetings of Paris the instrument he had come looking for. What that instrument was and what it cost him to acquire it is where the chronicle turns next, to a city of cafes and revolutionary newspapers and a peace conference that was going to change the world, where a young man in a rented suit appeared with a petition and discovered exactly how much the powerful cared about the opinions of the colonized. Chapter 2: The Young Man in Paris. The France that Nguyen Tat Tang arrived in was not the France of the colonial postcards that circulated in Indochina, the boulevards, the museums, the Republic of Liberty and Reason that the administration in Hanoi invoked whenever it needed to justify its presence. The France he encountered was a country of class stratification and labor disputes and political newspapers printed on cheap paper that argued with furious specificity about the organization of society. He arrived first as a kitchen worker on ships that docked at various Atlantic and American ports. There is evidence of a stay in Brooklyn, of time spent shoveling snow in Boston, of kitchen work in London at the Carlton Hotel under the chef Auguste Escoffier, who by one account noticed the young Vietnamese worker's intelligence and offered to train him in pastry. He stayed long enough in London to learn the language and observe the empire from its capital, then moved to Paris around 1917, and it was Paris that kept him. He arrived in a city that was still absorbing the weight of the war that had taken Vietnamese soldiers and laborers to the Western Front in the tens of thousands, conscripted from Indochina to fight and die for a republic that did not extend its rights to them. By 1917, roughly 100,000 Vietnamese had been brought to France as soldiers, as factory workers, as agricultural laborers filling the positions emptied by French men in the trenches. Some of them stayed. A community had formed in the working class districts of Paris. Several thousand Vietnamese, Algerians, Senegalese, Madagascans, living in cheap hotels near the Gare du Nord and the Gare de Lyon, reading newspapers from home when they arrived weeks late, sending money back when there was any to send. He moved into this community and began to write. The writing began as journalism, short pieces for left-wing French newspapers, arguing about colonial policy, about the treatment of Vietnamese subjects, about the gap between Republican ideals and colonial practice. He wrote under pseudonyms. He taught himself to write in French with a directness and economy that the editors of these papers found publishable, which was itself a significant achievement for a man who had been speaking the language for fewer than 5 years. His political education in Paris was conducted simultaneously through print and through conversation, through the reading rooms of the Bibliothèque Nationale, and through the meetings and arguments of the Parisian left, which in 1917 and 1918 was processing the Russian Revolution with an intensity that made every political question feel freshly open. The Vietnamese community in Paris numbered roughly 2,000 people by 1919, and among the politically active portion of it, the question of what the peace conference, the great post-war settlement that was going to redesign the map of the world, might mean for colonized peoples, was not an abstraction. Woodrow Wilson had arrived in Europe in January 1919 as something close to a secular messiah, the American president who had promised a peace based on justice and self-determination, who had articulated 14 points that seemed, to people reading them carefully in colonial territories, to contain something like a promise. Point 5 had called for an impartial adjustment of colonial claims. Point 10 had spoken of the autonomous development of peoples. The language was hedged in ways that a careful reader might notice, but a hopeful reader could find in it a commitment that the post-war order would not simply restore the pre-war colonial system and call it peace. He was a careful reader and a hopeful one simultaneously, which is perhaps the only combination that produces the particular kind of political action he took in the spring of 1919. Together with a small group from the Vietnamese expatriate community, he drafted a document, 8 points, modeled closely on Wilson's own 14, addressed to the Allied powers assembled at Versailles, requesting for Vietnam the same principles the conference was applying to the nations of Eastern Europe. The points were moderate by the standards of what he would later demand: amnesty for political prisoners, freedom of the press, freedom of association, the right to legal equality between Vietnamese and French subjects in Indochina, the replacement of French rule by decree with elected representative institutions. Not independence. Not yet. The document asked for the application of the principles the conference was already invoking for others. He needed a suit to present it. The record is specific on this point. He rented one. The Vietnamese community in Paris was not wealthy, and the young man who had spent years as a kitchen worker and a photo retoucher, he had learned the trade of hand coloring photographic portraits, a small technical skill that provided irregular income, did not own clothes appropriate for the corridors of the Paris Peace Conference. The rented suit was dark. He was small, slight, with watchful eyes and a manner that people who met him in this period consistently describe as simultaneously modest and quietly certain of himself. The petition was submitted. It was titled, in French, Revendication du peuple annamite, the claims of the Annamite people. He signed it with the name Nguyen Ai Cuc, Nguyen the Patriot, a name he had not used before and would use for the next 2 decades. Copies were delivered to the delegations of the major Allied powers. The American delegation received one. The British delegation received one. The French delegation, whose conference this largely was, and whose colonial possessions were not subject to Wilson's principles in any interpretation that the French government found binding, received one. None of them responded. Wilson's self-determination, as it turned out, was intended for the peoples of Europe, specifically for the peoples of the defeated empires, the Austro-Hungarian and the Ottoman, whose territories were being redesigned by the conference into new national units. For the peoples of Asia and Africa who were subjects of the victorious colonial powers, the principle simply did not apply. This was not an oversight. It was the operating logic of the conference, understood clearly by everyone in a position of actual authority, and the petition from the Vietnamese community in Paris was filed and forgotten with the quiet efficiency of an administration that had long since developed systems for processing inconvenient correspondence. He received help that was, in retrospect, more consequential than the petition itself. A French socialist politician named Paul Vaillant-Couturier read the petition and found it worth discussing. Through Vaillant-Couturier, he was introduced more formally to the organized French left, to the debates that were convulsing the French Socialist Party in the months following the Russian Revolution, to the arguments about whether to join Lenin's new Third International or maintain the older Second International's independence from Moscow, to the theoretical questions about colonialism and imperialism that Marxist political theory had been developing for decades, but that the mainstream European left had largely failed to connect to its own country's colonial possessions. He read widely and argued persistently. The reading rooms of Paris in 1919 and 1920 were full of political literature, and he moved through it with the focus of someone who was not reading for pleasure, but for a solution. The literature that stopped him, that he later described as the turning point, was not a thick theoretical work, but a relatively short text. Lenin's theses on the national and colonial question, published in 1920, written for the Second Comintern Congress, and arguing that the liberation of colonized peoples was not a secondary concern of international socialism, but a central one, that the revolutionary movements of Asia and Africa were not auxiliaries to the European working class movement, but co-equal participants in a global struggle against the same capitalist imperialism. He read it in a small reading room, the precise location of which he remembered years later as being associated with a Marxist bookshop on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine. He later said he read it 3 times in succession. He later said he wept. The weeping, he explained in retrospect, was not emotional collapse but recognition. the specific relief of a person who has been searching for a framework adequate to a problem they understand very clearly and who has finally found one. Here was a body of political thought that named colonial subjects as agents rather than objects. Here was an analysis that connected the poverty of Nghệ An province to the structure of global capitalism rather than to the particular cruelty of particular French administrators. Here was a movement that was not asking Vietnamese nationalists to wait for the conscience of the West to develop, but was offering them a theory of action and an international organization to act through. The Tours Congress of December 1920 was the moment of formal decision. The French Socialist Party gathered in the city of Tours to vote on whether to affiliate with Lenin's Communist International, the Comintern, the Third International, or to maintain its independence. The vote split the party permanently, with the majority voting to join and forming what became the French Communist Party. He voted with the majority. He was 29 or 30 years old, a Vietnamese kitchen worker and occasional journalist from a province in Indochina that most of the delegates at Tours could not have located on a map, and he stood up during the debate and made a short speech about colonialism, about what French socialism's failure to take colonialism seriously meant for the millions of people living under French colonial administration. The speech was brief and it was pointed. Vaillant Couturier later said it was one of the more effective moments of the Congress. The years between 1920 and 1923 in Paris were years of organizational consolidation. He wrote more, argued more, became a recognizable figure in the French Communist Party's colonial affairs discussions, and began to understand that Paris, for all it had given him, was now a staging point rather than a destination. The Comintern, the international communist organization headquartered in Moscow, was where the resources, the training, and the strategic direction were. Lenin had written about colonial liberation not as a humanitarian gesture, but as a strategic necessity for world revolution. The organization that Lenin had built was the only one in the world that was treating the question of Vietnamese independence as a legitimate and urgent political matter. He left for Moscow in 1923. He was 32 or 33 years old, depending on which of his several reported birth dates is accurate, a fact that is less trivial than it sounds, since he manipulated his biographical details throughout his life with the same ease he changed his names, leaving a historical record that is full of deliberate ambiguities. He left behind a city where he had learned to read an empire from its center, where he had discovered that the language of universal rights did not extend to colonial subjects, and where he had found in a reading room on a working-class street the intellectual framework he had been looking for since he was a teenager watching French troops disperse peasant marches in Hue. Paris had taught him what the empire looked like from the inside and what its principles actually meant in practice. What he needed now was the training, the network, and the institutional support to do something with that knowledge. Moscow had all three, and the organization waiting for him there was about to send him somewhere far more immediately useful than France, to the revolutionary ferment of southern China, where a generation of Vietnamese exiles was waiting for someone to tell them what to do and how to do it. Chapter 3: The Comintern Years. The Third International had its headquarters in a building near the Kremlin and it operated with the organized ambition of an institution that genuinely believed it was managing the early stages of a global revolution. By 1923, when Nguyen Ai Quoc arrived in Moscow, the Comintern had already sent agents to Germany, Hungary, China, India, and a dozen other countries where the conditions for revolutionary politics seemed, to its analysts, either ripe or worth cultivating. It maintained training schools, published theoretical journals in multiple languages, ran cipher communications networks, and maintained a bureaucracy staffed by revolutionary exiles from across the world who had washed up in Moscow because Moscow was the only place that would have them. He arrived as a relatively obscure figure, known in French communist circles, unknown almost everywhere else, and enrolled in the University of the Toilers of the East, which trained political cadres from colonized territories in Marxist theory, organizational method, and the specific techniques of underground political work. Moscow in 1923 was a city still sorting itself out from the revolution and the civil war that had followed it. Lenin was alive but incapacitated. He would die in January 1924, and the succession question was already organizing the relationships among the senior Bolsheviks in ways that would take years to fully resolve. For a Vietnamese student at the University of the Toilers of the East, the internal dynamics of Soviet leadership were less immediately relevant than the curriculum, which covered everything from the theory of imperialism to the organization of clandestine cells to the logistics of printing and distributing illegal literature. He studied. He attended Comintern meetings. He submitted reports on the situation in Indochina. He argued persistently that the colonial question in Asia deserved more organizational attention than the Comintern's European-focused leadership was inclined to give it. Lenin's death in January 1924 was mourned by communist organizations worldwide as the loss of the figure who had, more than any other, translated Marxist theory into actual revolutionary practice. For Nguyen Ai Quoc, reading the theses on the national and colonial question had been transformative, partly because of what Lenin had argued, and partly because of who Lenin was, a person who had successfully seized state power and built a governing structure from nothing, which was the kind of evidence that mattered more than any theoretical argument. He attended the funeral proceedings and wrote about them later with a directness that suggests the loss was genuine rather than performed. Then he continued his work because the organization Lenin had built continued without him, and the specific assignment that organization was preparing to give him was far more important than any further time in Moscow would be. In late 1924, the Comintern sent him to Canton, the southern Chinese city that was at that moment the center of the most dynamic revolutionary situation in Asia. The Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, was attempting to reunify China under Chiang Kai-shek's military leadership, and the Chinese Communist Party was operating as a junior partner in this effort under Comintern direction. The Soviet advisor coordinating the whole enterprise was Mikhail Borodin, a seasoned Comintern operative who had spent years in various international revolutionary assignments and who ran the Canton operation with considerable organizational sophistication. Borodin established Ho, who traveled to China as a Comintern agent under the name Lai Thu, as a translator and assistant, a cover that gave him access to the Kuomintang communist political world while providing plausible distance from the specifically Vietnamese organizational work he was actually there to do. The Whampoa Military Academy, established outside Canton in 1924 with Soviet support and Chiang Kai-shek as its commandant, was training the officer corps of the Nationalist Army. Among its students were Vietnamese exiles who had come to southern China looking for the same thing Phan Boi Chau had once looked for in Japan: a base, a training ground, a connection to a revolutionary movement with resources and method. He found them. Over the next 2 years, working alongside his Comintern duties, he gathered these Vietnamese exiles and began the organizational work that would eventually become the Vietnamese Communist movement. He ran training sessions. He produced political literature. He organized a group called the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, which was not yet a communist party, but was structured and indoctrinated in ways that made the transition straightforward when the time came. The training he offered was specific and practical. He taught political theory, the basic Leninist framework of imperialism and colonial liberation, but he taught it in terms that connected directly to the situation in Indochina, rather than in the abstract European terms in which he had first encountered it. He taught organizational method, the cell structure that allows an underground movement to survive the arrest of individual members without the entire network being exposed, because no individual member knows more than a small portion of it. He taught the discipline of clandestine work, the management of aliases, the protocols for communication across hostile territory, the difference between security and paranoia. These were not things that could be learned from books alone, and the Vietnamese exiles in Canton were learning them from someone who had spent years practicing them. Among the things he also taught, less deliberately, was a model of political comportment that several of his students later described with consistent language: the quality of taking a person seriously regardless of their social background, of explaining difficult ideas without condescension, of combining complete ideological conviction with what one former student called a kind of personal modesty that made you feel the conviction was earned rather than performed. This is a description of a specific kind of political intelligence, the ability to build loyalty not through charisma of the loud kind, but through the quieter authority of someone who clearly knows more than you do and is willing to share it. The situation in Canton began to deteriorate in early 1927. Chiang Kai-shek, having consolidated enough military power to dispense with his communist allies, moved against them in April with sudden and comprehensive violence. The Shanghai Massacre of April 12 killed thousands of Chinese Communist Party members in a single day. The Canton network followed within weeks. Borodin fled to the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party went underground. The Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, which had been operating with the protection of the Comintern Communist Alliance, lost its base entirely. He was not in Canton when the purge hit. He had already moved, under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear in the historical record, and was likely already back in Moscow or in transit. What he left behind was a network that survived the purge partially, because the cell structure he had taught was designed exactly for this kind of catastrophic disruption. Not all of it survived. Several of the cadres he had trained were captured and killed, but the organizational logic persisted in the people who got out, and they carried it with them into the years of underground work that followed. The period between 1927 and 1930 was among the most itinerant of his life. He moved through Moscow, through Brussels, through Berlin, through Paris briefly, through Siam, present-day Thailand, where a Vietnamese exile community provided a base of operations that was geographically closer to Indochina than Europe. He was working under constant surveillance risk, using multiple aliases, attending Comintern meetings when he could get there, maintaining communication with the scattered remnants of his Vietnamese network through channels that were always insecure and sometimes went silent for months. Siam was where he did much of the organizational groundwork for what became the founding conference of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. The conference itself was held in Hong Kong in February 1930, a meeting of representatives from 3 separate Vietnamese communist factions that had been operating in parallel and occasionally in conflict, which he was sent by the Comintern to unify into a single organization. He convened the meeting in a room rented under a false name somewhere in the Kowloon district, and over several days the delegates agreed on a unified structure, a party program, and a set of organizational principles drawn directly from Leninist party theory. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party came into existence in February 1930 as a formal institution with a central committee, a program, and a clandestine network reaching into Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The founding had cost roughly a decade of work. It had cost the loss of the Canton network, the years of exile, the accumulated risk of living under false names in cities where discovery meant arrest, and arrest in a colonial territory meant execution. It had also produced something genuinely new, a Vietnamese political organization that was simultaneously nationalist in its goals, the liberation of Indochina from French colonialism, and internationalist in its framework, connected to the global communist movement and trained in its organizational methods. The earlier nationalist movements, Phan Boi Chau's Dong Du and its successors, had been organized around the Confucian scholar gentry class and had looked outward to Asian patrons. This one was organized around a different social base: workers, peasants, the rural poor of Nuan, and the factory workers of Hanoi and Haiphong, and it had a theory of why those people were the right foundation for a liberation movement rather than a practical compromise with available personnel. He was 40 years old, or thereabouts, when the party was formally established. He had spent almost 20 years outside Vietnam. He had been trained by the world's leading revolutionary organization, had built and lost networks across 2 continents, and had produced a body of political writing that was circulating in clandestine copies through the Vietnamese underground. He had developed the patience, not as a temperamental quality, but as a strategic discipline to work across timeframes that most political actors find psychologically impossible. The party was founded. Now, almost immediately, the French colonial administration set about destroying it. What happened next would come close to succeeding, and the chronicle of those years, the guillotine in Vinh, the prisons in Hong Kong, the near annihilation of everything he had spent a decade building, is where the story turns. Chapter 4: The Years the Movement Nearly Died. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party had existed for less than 8 months when the French colonial administration began killing it. The instrument of destruction arrived not in response to the party's founding. The Hong Kong Conference had been small enough and clandestine enough to escape immediate notice, but in response to something that happened in Ho's home province of Nghệ An in the autumn of 1930, something that the party had not planned and could not fully control, and that would bring down on the entire Vietnamese communist movement a repression of a scale and ferocity that came close to ending it permanently. The Nghệ Teen Soviet uprising began as a series of strikes and demonstrations among factory workers in Vinh and the surrounding industrial areas in early 1930, and spread through the summer into a peasant rebellion that swept across both Nghệ An and the neighboring province of Ha Tinh with a speed that surprised everyone, including the ICP cadres who were nominally trying to lead it. The conditions that produced it were not mysterious. The global depression of 1929 had hit the colonial economy with particular force. Rubber prices had collapsed, rice prices had fallen, and the French administration had responded to its own revenue shortfall by increasing taxation on Vietnamese subjects rather than reducing it. In Nghệ An, which had never been prosperous, the combination of falling wages, rising taxes, and a drought that had reduced the rice harvest pushed rural communities past the point of ordinary endurance. The peasants who marched on district capitals in the summer and autumn of 1930 were not carrying a coherent political program. They were carrying the accumulated weight of decades of extraction and the specific, acute desperation of communities that had run out of ordinary options. ICP cadres moved among them, tried to organize the marches, tried to channel the energy into something with a political structure, and in some districts succeeded well enough to establish what were called Soviets, local committees that took over administrative functions, redistributed some land, canceled some debts, and operated as a shadow government for periods ranging from a few weeks to several months. The name was borrowed from the Russian revolutionary experience and applied to something considerably more improvised, but it represented, however briefly, the first time since French conquest that Vietnamese peasants had governed themselves in any formal sense. The French response was methodical and overwhelming. Aircraft bombed villages where resistance was concentrated. Infantry columns moved through the province in coordinated sweeps. Arrests were conducted in numbers that filled the colonial prisons beyond their designed capacity. Thousands of people detained, sorted, and processed through courts that were operating under emergency provisions. The ICP Central Committee members who had been directing the uprising, or attempting to, were identified, hunted, and captured with a thoroughness that reflected how much intelligence the colonial administration had already accumulated about the party's structure. By the end of 1931, the Central Committee had been effectively destroyed. Most of its members were either dead or in prison. The provincial networks that had taken years to build were dismantled cell by cell as captured members, under interrogation, gave up what they knew. The guillotine arrived in Vinh in the spring of 1931. This was not a spontaneous act of colonial violence, but a deliberate administrative decision. The transportation of the instrument to the provincial capital was intended to be visible, to constitute a message that could be read across the province without translation. Public executions by guillotine in a city that everyone in Nghệ An province knew, in a public space, conducted with enough ceremony to ensure they were witnessed and reported. The calculation was that visible state violence of sufficient scale would accomplish what the arrests alone might not merely the destruction of the existing network, but the deterrence of the next one. Several ICP leaders were executed in this manner. The exact number varies in different accounts, but the political leadership of the party in the most active provinces was largely eliminated. He was not in Vietnam when any of this happened. He was in Hong Kong, working under the alias Tong Van So, trying to maintain communication with the shattered networks and assess what could be salvaged. Hong Kong in 1931 was a British colonial territory with its own political police and its own arrangements with the French colonial administration regarding the exchange of information about communist agitators operating in Asia. In June 1931, acting on intelligence that had almost certainly been shared across colonial security services, British police arrested him at a house in the Kowloon district. He was taken to Victoria Gaol, the main colonial prison in Hong Kong, and held while the British government determined what to do with him. The British position was complicated. He had committed no crime under Hong Kong law that was straightforwardly prosecutable. Extraditing him to French Indochina would have meant delivering him to an administration that would certainly execute him, which raised legal questions about the proper limits of colonial cooperation that a British court could be persuaded to take seriously. The French applied pressure. The Comintern, through its legal networks, arranged for a British lawyer named Frank Lousby to take his case. Lousby was not a communist sympathizer in any committed sense. He was a Hong Kong solicitor who saw a genuine legal argument and was willing to make it. And the argument he made was procedural, that the extradition request did not meet the formal legal requirements under British colonial law, and that the colonial administration could not simply hand a prisoner to a foreign power because that power wanted him. The case took approximately 18 months to resolve. He remained in Victoria Gaol while it did, held in conditions that were not the worst he would experience in his life, but were not comfortable, in a British colonial prison in a city where the question of his future was being decided by lawyers and administrators who were weighing his life against the inconvenience of a legal precedent. Lousby eventually succeeded. The formal grounds were technical enough that the French could not immediately appeal them, and in late 1932 he was released, not freed exactly, but released into a legal ambiguity that allowed him to leave Hong Kong without being handed to the French. What followed was several years of extraordinary precariousness. He moved through Shanghai, where the Comintern maintained underground networks, then back to Moscow for a period of recovery. His health had deteriorated significantly during the imprisonment, then eventually to Siam again, where the Vietnamese exile community continued to provide cover. These were years in which communication with what remained of the ICP inside Vietnam was intermittent at best and sometimes non-existent. The party had not been destroyed entirely. Enough cadres had survived. Enough organizational knowledge had been preserved in the people who escaped the 1931 repression that reconstruction was possible in principle. But the scale of the destruction was such that the reconstruction would take years, and the years required were years he spent largely cut off from the country whose liberation he had been organizing toward for 2 decades. The psychological texture of this period is difficult to recover from the historical record, because he was not someone who documented his interior life in ways that survived or were intended to survive. What can be said is that the evidence of his behavior across this period, the continued organizational work, the maintenance of clandestine communication, the writing of political analyses that he continued to produce and submit to Comintern contacts even when there was no clear audience for them, suggests a person who had made a decision at some fundamental level not to treat the near destruction of the movement as evidence that the project was wrong. The movement had been nearly destroyed before, in Canton in 1927. It had been rebuilt. The 1931 repression was worse. The principle was the same. Inside Vietnam, meanwhile, the reconstruction proceeded without him. The ICP members who had survived, those who had been in areas where the repression was less thorough, those who had been out of the country, those who had been in prison and eventually released, began the slow work of rebuilding networks from the fragments. The party that reassembled itself across the mid-1930s was smaller, more cautious, and organizationally flatter than what had existed before 1931. The experience of having its entire central leadership eliminated in a single year had produced a structural lesson that the survivors incorporated into the rebuilt organization. Concentration of leadership knowledge in identifiable individuals was a vulnerability that the next version of the party would try to reduce. The French Popular Front government, which came to power in 1936 under Léon Blum, briefly eased the colonial repression, releasing political prisoners, permitting some forms of legal political activity, creating a small opening in which Vietnamese nationalist politics could breathe. The ICP used this opening carefully. Legal newspapers, legal labor organizing, legal participation in the political discussions that the Popular Front's reforms permitted. These were instruments for rebuilding public presence and recruiting new members in conditions that were still fundamentally colonial but temporarily less violent. When the Popular Front collapsed in 1938 and the French administration returned to its previous posture, the ICP was measurably stronger than it had been at the low point of 1932. He returned to Moscow in the mid-1930s, where the internal politics of the Soviet Union were moving through the purge years. The show trials, the elimination of old Bolsheviks, the institutional terror that was consuming people he had known and worked with across his years in the international communist movement. Several Comintern figures who had been his colleagues were arrested and disappeared. He was, by his own account, and the account of those who knew him in Moscow during this period, careful, not politically withdrawn, but careful in the specific sense of someone who understood that the wrong association or the wrong sentence at the wrong moment could end a life, and who had developed over decades the discipline of knowing which conversations to have and which to avoid. By 1938, he was back in China, this time in Yan'an, where Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party had established its base after the Long March. The Sino-Japanese War had restructured the political landscape of East Asia in ways that created new possibilities for Vietnamese nationalism. Japan's invasion of China had shaken the colonial order, and the question of what would happen to French Indochina if France itself were threatened in Europe was becoming increasingly concrete. He watched these developments with the attention of someone who had been studying the international situation for 20 years and who could see in the gathering crisis of the late 1930s the outline of an opening. The opening arrived faster than even he had anticipated. In June 1940, France fell. The German army entered Paris. The colonial administration in Indochina, suddenly orphaned from a metropole that had ceased to function as a great power, faced Japanese pressure to allow the stationing of Japanese troops on Vietnamese territory, and after brief resistance, complied. French Indochina was now simultaneously a French colony and a Japanese-occupied territory, an unstable combination that had hollowed out both sources of authority and left, for the first time in decades, a genuine political vacuum. He was 50 years old and had been outside Vietnam for nearly 30 years. The vacuum he had been working toward for his entire adult life had finally opened. The question was whether he could get back inside it before it closed, and what he would build there in the mountains near the Chinese border before the world caught up to what he was doing. Chapter 5: The Return. In February 1941, for the first time in 30 years, Ho Chi Minh crossed the border into Vietnam. He came on foot through the limestone mountains of Cao Bang province, along paths that the local Tay ethnic minority communities knew and the French border police did not adequately patrol. He was 50 or 51 years old, thin from years of irregular living, carrying almost nothing. The border crossing was physically unremarkable, a line on a map, a change in the political jurisdiction of the mountains, the same karst landscape on both sides. What it represented was the end of the longest preparation in the history of Vietnamese nationalism. He had left as a kitchen worker on a French steamer. He came back as the head of an international revolutionary organization trained by the Comintern, tested by prison and exile, and the near destruction of everything he had built, carrying in his head a theory of liberation that he had spent 3 decades refining against the resistance of actual events. The place he chose as his base was a cave called Pac Bo in the mountains of Cao Bang province, approximately 3 kilometers from the Chinese border, close enough that a rapid withdrawal across the frontier was possible if the French mounted a serious search operation, remote enough that casual discovery was unlikely. The cave sat beside a small stream that ran through a narrow valley, and the surrounding forest was dense enough to conceal movement. He named the stream the Linen Stream and the mountain above it Karl Marx Mountain, with a directness that was also perhaps a kind of private humor, the naming of a Vietnamese mountain range after European theorists by a man who had spent his life translating European theory into Vietnamese conditions. A small group of trusted cadres established themselves in the vicinity. A routine developed: political work in the mornings, writing and correspondence in the afternoons, the discipline of maintaining organizational continuity in conditions that were essentially those of a fugitive camp. The political work at Pac Bo was the construction of the Viet Minh, the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh Hoi, the League for the Independence of Vietnam, which he founded at a conference in May 1941. The Viet Minh was a deliberate departure from the organizational model of the ICP, though the ICP remained its core. The departure was strategic. The Viet Minh presented itself not as a communist organization, but as a broad nationalist front, open to any Vietnamese person who supported independence from France and Japan, regardless of their class position or ideological affiliation. Landlords could join. Buddhist monks could join. Members of the old scholar gentry class, whose political instincts were conservative rather than revolutionary, could join. The communist character of the organization's leadership was real but subordinated. In the public presentation of the Viet Minh to the national liberation goal, that was the one thing all Vietnamese anti-colonial opinion had in common. This was not a tactical deception in the simple sense. He had argued within the Comintern for years that the liberation of colonized peoples required broad nationalist fronts rather than narrowly class-based parties, and the argument was genuine. He believed it as a matter of political analysis, not merely as a matter of convenience. The Vietnamese peasantry, which was the social base any serious liberation movement needed to cultivate, did not think in terms of class struggle. It thought in terms of the land, the village, the nation, and the specific oppression of foreign rule. A movement that spoke only the language of international proletarian solidarity would lose it. A movement that spoke the language of Vietnamese independence, filtered through structures that the ICP cadres were quietly building and controlling, could reach it. The months at Pac Bo were also months of watching the international situation develop with the attention it deserved. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. Japan was expanding aggressively across Southeast Asia. The United States, still formally neutral, was moving toward confrontation with Japan in ways that anyone reading the newspapers carefully could see were accelerating. He read what he could get, thought about the configuration of forces, and arrived at an assessment that would define the Viet Minh's international strategy for the next 4 years. The most useful potential patron for Vietnamese independence, given the developing alignment of powers, was not the Soviet Union, which was consumed with its own survival, and not China, which was in the middle of its own war, but the United States, the anti-colonial republic that had its own historical reasons for opposing the European colonial empires, and that was heading toward a war with Japan that would require allies in Southeast Asia. The assessment was not naive. He understood that American anti-colonialism had limits, and that American strategic interests would not always align with Vietnamese ones. But the American Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence organization that preceded the CIA, was operating in southern China and needed intelligence about Japanese movements in Indochina, and the Viet Minh, with its networks inside Vietnam, was in a position to provide it. Contact was established through intermediaries in 1944 and formalized in early 1945 when an OSS team made direct connection with Ho's organization. The OSS agents who met him were, by their own subsequent accounts, surprised. They had expected, perhaps, a fire-breathing revolutionary. They found a small, thin, quietly spoken man in his 50s who cited Abraham Lincoln, expressed admiration for the American Declaration of Independence, and asked thoughtful questions about American political history. They gave him the code name Lucius. They provided medicines. He was ill with malaria and dysentery during this period, seriously enough that some accounts suggest he came close to dying in early 1945, and they provided weapons and training for Viet Minh units that were harassing Japanese installations. The year 1945 moved with a speed that compressed into a few months the consequences of the entire preceding decade. In March, the Japanese, apparently concerned that the French colonial administration in Indochina was preparing to shift its allegiance to the Allies as the war turned, moved to eliminate French authority entirely, arresting French administrators and officers, dismantling the colonial governing structure, and installing the Vietnamese Emperor Bao Dai as the nominal head of a Japanese-backed Vietnamese state. The French colonial administration that had governed Indochina for 60 years was gone in a single night. In August, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. The political vacuum that had been opening since 1940 was now complete. France was not yet back, Japan was gone. The nominal Bao Dai government had no real power, and the Viet Minh, which had spent 4 years building its networks and its armed units precisely for this moment, was the only organized political force in the country with both a national presence and a functioning military structure. What followed was the August Revolution, less a revolution in the classic sense than an extraordinarily rapid transfer of power into the vacuum, conducted with enough speed and coordination that it was largely over before any external power could intervene. Viet Minh committees took over administration in city after city across Vietnam during the third week of August 1945. Bao Dai, reading the situation with the pragmatism of a man who had always understood his own position clearly, abdicated on August 25, handing the imperial seal and sword to Viet Minh representatives and issuing a statement that he preferred to be a citizen of a free country than the king of an enslaved one. The statement was almost certainly written with Viet Minh assistance, but its substance was accurate enough. He arrived in Hanoi on August 26, 1945, entering the city for the first time in his life. He had never lived in the northern capital before. The city was hung with red flags. Crowds filled the streets. The atmosphere was, by all accounts, one of genuine popular celebration mixed with the specific anxiety of people who understood that what had just happened was extraordinary and fragile and might not last. He was in poor health, still recovering from the illnesses of the preceding months, and the photographs from this period show a man who looks older than his years, with the careful, controlled expression of someone who knows that the moment is real, but that its durability is not yet established. On September 6, 1945, in Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi, before a crowd estimated at several 100,000 people, he read aloud the Declaration of Independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He had written it himself in the preceding days, and he had opened it with words that he had carried with him since his time reading American political history. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The words were Jefferson's, translated into Vietnamese. He paused partway through the reading and asked the crowd through the microphone, "Fellow countrymen, can you hear me?" The crowd answered, "Yes." He continued, "The moment has been analyzed many times for what it reveals about his political calculation. The citation of Jefferson as a signal to the American OSS agents present that he was someone the United States could work with, the invocation of universal rights as a reframing of Vietnamese independence from a communist project into a human one. All of that analysis is accurate and relevant. What it misses is the simpler fact. He had been working toward this moment for 34 years, since he stepped on a boat in Saigon Harbor with nothing, and the words he chose to open the declaration of the country he had spent his life trying to free were the words of another revolution against another empire, written by a man who owned slaves but understood something true about what governments owe the people they govern. The citation was calculation. It was also conviction. In him, those two things had always been the same. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam existed, formally and actually, for approximately 16 weeks before the French returned in sufficient force to contest it. The period between September 1945 and December 1946 was one of negotiation, maneuver, and the gradual erosion of the possibility that France would accept Vietnamese independence on terms that the DRV could live with. He negotiated in good faith, or at least in the faith that a settlement was possible, traveling to France in the summer of 1946 for talks that produced a preliminary agreement that both sides then interpreted in contradictory ways. The French wanted to restore their colonial position under a different name. He wanted genuine independence and was willing to accept a transitional arrangement to get there. The gap between those positions was not bridgeable by negotiation alone. In December 1946, French forces bombarded Haiphong. He issued a call to national resistance. The First Indochina War had begun, and with it the next phase of a story that would run for another 30 years, a phase that would carry the chronicle from the caves of Pac Bo to the valley of Dien Bien Phu, through the longest and most consequential military campaign in the history of Vietnamese nationalism. But before that war reached its defining battle, there was an interruption, a prison cell in Guangxi province, a set of chains, and 134 poems written in classical Chinese by a man who had learned, across a very long life, how to keep his mind intact when everything else was taken from him. Chapter 6: The Prisoner and the Poet. In August 1942, roughly a year after establishing the Viet Minh at Pac Bo, he crossed back into China on a mission that the historical record describes with varying degrees of precision depending on the source. The stated purpose was to make contact with Chinese nationalist authorities and with the Free French forces operating in southern China, to establish the kind of great power relationship that the Viet Minh needed to survive the war years, and that he had been attempting to build in one form or another since his first petition at Versailles. He traveled under yet another alias, carrying documents that identified him as a journalist representing Vietnamese nationalist interests. Somewhere in Guangxi province, within days of crossing the border, he was arrested by local nationalist Chinese forces who did not find his documents convincing and who suspected, with the generalized suspicion of a country at war on multiple fronts, that he was a French spy. The suspicion was not entirely irrational from the perspective of the nationalist officers who detained him. He was a Vietnamese man crossing into China with papers that did not quite cohere, claiming to represent an organization they had not heard of, in a province where French colonial intelligence had been operating for years. The distinction between a French agent and a Vietnamese anti-French revolutionary was not, to a Guangxi provincial garrison, an obvious one. He was taken into custody, processed through the local military bureaucracy, and eventually transferred into the prison system of Guangxi province, where he would spend the next 13 months being moved between facilities, chained at night, and held in conditions that deteriorated his health measurably and steadily. The prisons of Guangxi in 1942 and 1943 were not places of systematic torture in the way that French colonial prisons in Indochina could be, but they were places of significant hardship. He was chained at the ankles each night, a standard precaution for political prisoners in the Chinese nationalist system, and the chains were heavy enough and the sleeping surfaces rough enough that the cumulative physical effect across months was considerable. He was moved between facilities 13 times over the course of his imprisonment, each transfer conducted on foot or by cart over distances that varied but were never trivial, in weather that ranged from the subtropical heat of the Guangxi summer to the cold of the mountain passes in winter. He lost weight steadily. OSS contacts who eventually saw him after his release noted the physical deterioration with enough specificity to suggest it had been significant. A man already thin from years of irregular living, reduced further by a year of prison rations and inadequate shelter. What he did with the imprisonment was characteristic. He wrote, "Not political analysis. There was no audience for that, no channel for distributing it, and in any case the conditions were not conducive to sustained argumentative prose. What he wrote were poems, classical Chinese poems, composed in the regulated verse forms of the Tang Dynasty tradition, the same literary framework that Vietnamese scholar-gentlemen had used for centuries, the tradition his father Nguyen Sinh Sac had been educated in, and that he himself had learned as part of his Confucian formation before he left Vietnam. The poems accumulated across the months of imprisonment into what he would later title the Prison Diary, Nat Ki Trum Tu, a collection of 134 poems covering the entire arc of the imprisonment, from the first arrest through the transfers and the daily conditions of prison life to the eventual release. The poems are not what a reader expecting revolutionary literature might anticipate. They do not argue. They do not organize. They do not call for the liberation of Vietnam or theorize the colonial condition or instruct cadres in the correct application of Marxist-Leninist principles. They notice things. A small bird outside a prison window, the cold of a particular morning in the mountains, the sound of rain on a roof of inadequate tiles, the weight of chains that have been worn long enough to become familiar, the moon seen through prison bars, which the classical Chinese poetic tradition had been writing about for 1,000 years before he added his own observations to it. A fellow prisoner's cough. The particular quality of light in a valley he was marched through between one facility and the next. The decision to write in classical Chinese rather than Vietnamese or French was not incidental. Classical Chinese was the literary language of the East Asian scholarly tradition, the language in which educated Vietnamese had conducted their most serious written communication for centuries, the language of the Mandarin examination that his father had passed and that the French colonial administration had spent decades dismantling. Writing in it was a claim to a cultural inheritance that the colonial system had been trying to sever. It was also a practical choice. Classical Chinese verse forms are among the most rigorously constrained in any literary tradition, requiring specific tonal patterns, specific rhyme schemes, specific syllable counts per line, and the discipline of working within those constraints is itself a form of mental exercise, a way of keeping the mind engaged and ordered when the external circumstances offer neither engagement nor order. He had written in the tradition before, occasionally. In prison, he wrote in it every day or close to it. The accumulation of 134 poems across 13 months suggests a pace of roughly 3 poems per week, enough to constitute a practice, a discipline, a daily act of maintaining the self against the erosion that imprisonment performs on a person's sense of their own continuity. Several of the poems address this directly, with the oblique indirection of the classical tradition. The image of a man in chains is also the image of any constraint. The image of a bird that cannot fly is also the image of a movement temporarily grounded. The image of the moon continuing its path regardless of whether the observer is free or imprisoned is also an observation about historical time and the smallness of any individual captivity within it. Outside the prison walls, meanwhile, the movement he had left behind was continuing without him. Vo Nguyen Giap, the young history teacher from Quang Binh province, whom he had recruited into the Viet Minh and who would become the most consequential military commander in Vietnamese history, was building the armed units of the Viet Minh in the base areas of Cao Bang and Bac Can provinces. Giap had no formal military training. He had a history degree, a fierce intelligence, and access to a small library of military theory that he read with the same focused purpose that Ho had brought to his political reading in Paris 20 years earlier. He organized, he trained, he conducted small operations against French and Japanese targets. He made mistakes and learned from them with the unsentimental efficiency of someone who understood that mistakes in his position were fatal and that the only response to them was correction rather than repetition. The Viet Minh that Giap was building in 1942 and 1943 was not yet a serious military force by any conventional measure. Its armed units were small, lightly equipped, and operating in difficult terrain against opponents with vastly superior firepower. What they were building was not yet the capacity to win battles, but the capacity to survive them. The organizational infrastructure, the local support networks, the supply chains and communication systems, and recruitment pipelines that would eventually make a genuine armed struggle possible. This was the slow foundational work that revolutions require and that military history tends to compress into a few paragraphs before reaching the battles, but that in practice consumes years and the effort of thousands of people doing unglamorous organizational labor in conditions of constant risk. His release came in September 1943, approximately 13 months after his arrest. The mechanism was political rather than legal. Chiang Kai-shek's government had arrived at the calculation that a living Vietnamese communist who could organize anti-Japanese intelligence networks in Indochina was more useful than a dead one, and that the Viet Minh, whatever its ideological character, was an available instrument for gathering information about Japanese movements that the Chinese nationalist forces needed. He was released, given a small stipend, and attached nominally to a Chinese nationalist Vietnamese exile organization as a liaison, a cover that gave him freedom of movement in southern China, while allowing the nationalist authorities to maintain the fiction that he was working for them rather than for his own organization. He crossed back into Vietnam in late 1943 or early 1944, rejoining the Viet Minh base areas that Giap had been maintaining and expanding. The reunion was, by the accounts of those present, businesslike rather than emotional. The work had continued. The organizational situation was better than when he had left, and there was too much to do for extended reflection on the fact of survival. He was thinner than when he had left. He had a collection of poems. He had also, during the months of imprisonment, had time to think without the pressure of immediate organizational demands, and the thinking had produced a clarity about the coming endgame, the collapse of Japanese authority, the likely American intervention in Southeast Asia, the window that would open, that shaped the Viet Minh's strategic positioning for the next 2 years. The prison diary was eventually published years later and became one of the most widely read works of Vietnamese literature of the 20th century. It is read now in Vietnamese schools as a document of national resistance and personal endurance. What it actually is, at the level of the individual poems, is something quieter and more interesting than either of those categories suggests. The record of a specific person in a specific set of circumstances, noticing what was around him with a precision that the classical forms required and that the conditions of imprisonment paradoxically made easier. When the world contracts to a cell and a chain and a small rectangle of sky, the available objects of attention become very clear. He had survived the imprisonment the way he had survived everything else, by continuing, by working within whatever constraints were available, by treating the present difficulty as a condition to be endured, rather than a verdict on the project. The project, when he returned to it in the mountains of Cao Bang in late 1943, was entering its most consequential phase. The war that would end French colonialism in Indochina was still 2 years away from its defining moment, still building toward the valley in the northwest mountains where French military confidence would finally exhaust itself against an opponent it had never adequately imagined. That valley, and the 55 days that decided everything that came after, is where the chronicle moves next. Chapter 7: The Valley and the Siege. Dien Bien Phu is a rice-growing valley in the mountains of northwestern Vietnam, roughly 20 kilometers long and perhaps 8 kilometers wide at its broadest point, ringed on all sides by forested hills that rise steeply from the valley floor. The Nam Yum River runs through it. In peacetime, it was a place of modest agricultural productivity, inhabited by Thai ethnic minority communities who had been farming the valley floor for generations. It had one airstrip, built by the Japanese during their occupation, and a small administrative presence. It was, by any ordinary measure, an unremarkable piece of geography. What made it consequential was the hills, the fact that whoever controlled the high ground around the valley controlled the valley itself, completely and without qualification, and the decision, made in the autumn of 1953 by the French military command in Indochina, to install a large garrison in the valley floor and invite the Viet Minh to come and fight for it. The logic of the decision, as General Henri Navarre understood it, was strategically coherent within a set of assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The French had spent 7 years fighting a war against an opponent that refused to engage in the kind of set-piece battle where French firepower superiority could be decisive. The Viet Minh fought from the jungle, retreated when pressed, harassed supply lines, and avoided the direct confrontation that would have allowed the French to use their artillery and air power to full effect. Navarre's plan, Operation Castor, launched in November 1953, was to create the conditions for exactly that confrontation by establishing a fortified base in the valley, which he calculated would threaten the Viet Minh's supply lines into Laos and force them to attack it. When they attacked, the French artillery and air cover would destroy them. The calculation required the Viet Minh to be unable to bring artillery to the hills above the valley. Navarre's intelligence assessment held that this was effectively impossible, that the terrain between the Viet Minh's base areas and Dien Bien Phu was too difficult, the distances too great, and the logistical capacity of an irregular force too limited to move heavy weapons over mountain passes and through jungle in sufficient quantity to threaten a well-fortified position. This assessment was delivered with the confidence of an institution that had been fighting in Indochina for 7 years without adequately updating its model of what its opponent was capable of organizing. Vo Nguyen Giap understood the valley's geometry immediately when the French established their garrison there. He understood that whoever held the hills held everything, and he began planning the operation that would take the hills with a methodical thoroughness that reflected both his own temperament and the institutional knowledge the Viet Minh had accumulated across 7 years of war. The plan required moving 4 divisions, approximately 50,000 men, into position around the valley, along with artillery, 105mm howitzers, 75mm mountain guns, anti-aircraft weapons. The artillery presented the central logistical problem of the entire operation. A single 105mm howitzer, disassembled into its component parts for transport, still weighed over 1,000 kilograms in total. The route from the Viet Minh's supply areas to the hills above Dien Bien Phu crossed several hundred kilometers of mountain terrain, on paths that were barely paths, through jungle that artillery wheels could not navigate without being cut away. The solution was human. Giap mobilized approximately 200,000 civilian porters, men, women, and older children from the villages of the northwest, to carry the disassembled artillery pieces to the hills. They carried on their backs, on reinforced bicycles loaded far beyond the bicycle's designed capacity, on improvised sledges dragged up slopes that carts could not manage. The howitzers were disassembled into their heaviest components and distributed among teams of carriers who moved in relays, passing loads forward through the column. The process was agonizingly slow and physically brutal. Porters died from exhaustion, from falls on the mountain paths, from French airstrikes that attacked the supply columns when they were spotted. The columns moved largely at night to reduce visibility from the air, which meant moving on mountain paths without adequate light, which compounded the accidents. The casualty rate among the porter columns was significant enough to be documented in later accounts as a cost of the operation that Giap acknowledged and accepted. The French military planners, watching through aerial reconnaissance as Viet Minh forces moved into the hills, were aware that something was happening but did not fully grasp its scale until it was too late to adjust their position. There was a moment in late January 1954, approximately 6 weeks before the main assault began, when Giap himself reportedly ordered a pause in the operation, not because the French had discovered the artillery positions, but because he had reassessed his original plan of attack and concluded it was wrong. His initial plan had called for a rapid assault, relying on surprise. On reflection, he decided that a rapid assault against a fortified position of that strength, without adequate preparation of the artillery positions, would produce unacceptable casualties and risked failure. He changed the plan entirely, ordering the artillery pieces that had already been laboriously dragged into position to be dug into the hillsides in reinforced emplacements, a process that required weeks of additional labor so that they could fire from protected positions rather than exposed ones. The pause cost time. It also meant that when the battle began, the French counter-battery fire was far less effective than it would have been against artillery in the open. The assault opened on March 13, 1954. Viet Minh artillery began firing from the hills at a range and volume that the French garrison's commander, General Christian de Castries, had not expected and could not adequately counter. The French artillery commander, Colonel Charles Piroth, who had assured Navarre that the Viet Minh could not bring effective artillery to bear, withdrew to his dugout on the evening of March 13 and killed himself with a grenade. The detail is recorded in multiple French accounts of the battle and stands as a compressed expression of what Navarre's fundamental error had cost. An officer who had staked his professional judgment on an impossibility and could not survive the discovery that it was possible. The garrison at Dien Bien Phu consisted of approximately 15,000 French Union troops, including French regulars, foreign legionnaires, Vietnamese soldiers fighting for the French, Moroccan, and Algerian troops, organized around a central command position and a series of outlying strongpoints that Castries had named, with a whimsy that the circumstances made retrospectively grim, after women: Gabrielle, Beatrice, Anne-Marie, Dominique, Eliane, Huguette. The strongpoints fell in sequence. Beatrice fell on the first night of the assault. Gabrielle fell the following day. Anne-Marie was abandoned as its Thai auxiliary garrison melted away into the surrounding jungle. Each fall contracted the perimeter of the French position, reduced the usable area of the airstrip, and brought Viet Minh infantry closer to the central command bunkers. The French attempted to supply the garrison by air, which had been the assumption behind the entire operational plan, that the airstrip would remain functional and that supplies and reinforcements could be flown in regardless of what happened on the ground. The Viet Minh anti-aircraft weapons, also dragged over the mountains by the porter columns, made the airstrip increasingly dangerous to use. French transport aircraft were shot down. Pilots began refusing missions. Supply drops by parachute became the primary method of resupply, and a significant portion of the dropped supplies fell outside the perimeter into Viet Minh hands as the perimeter shrank. The mathematics of the siege were working systematically against the garrison. The siege ran for 55 days. The conditions inside the French perimeter deteriorated from difficult to genuinely terrible. The wounded accumulated in the central medical facility faster than they could be treated. The defensive positions became increasingly waterlogged as the spring rains arrived, and the garrison's ability to mount counterattacks diminished as casualties reduced the available infantry. Castries communicated with the Hanoi command by radio, requesting reinforcements that could not be delivered in sufficient quantity without air superiority that the French no longer had over the valley. The reinforcements that did arrive, paratroopers dropped into the shrinking perimeter, were absorbed into the defense and could not reverse the attrition that was consuming the garrison from the perimeter inward. Outside the valley, the battle's significance was understood in Paris and in Washington in terms that went beyond the military. The French government had been negotiating at Geneva since February about the future of Indochina, and the military situation at Dien Bien Phu was moving in direct parallel with those negotiations in a way that concentrated the minds of everyone at the conference table. The Eisenhower administration in Washington considered and ultimately rejected direct American military intervention, including in some internal discussions, the possible use of tactical nuclear weapons to relieve the garrison. The rejection reflected a calculation that the political costs of direct intervention outweighed the strategic costs of a French defeat, a calculation that the United States would revisit with different conclusions within a decade. On May 7, 1954, the last French strongpoints fell. Castries was captured in his command bunker. The remaining garrison, approximately 10,000 survivors, many of them wounded, surrendered and began the march to Viet Minh prison camps, a journey that a significant number of them did not survive. The battle had cost the Viet Minh approximately 8,000 dead and 15,000 wounded, casualties that Giap later acknowledged were higher than necessary, a consequence of tactical decisions in the final phase that he subjected to sustained self-criticism in his later writings. The French had lost approximately 2,000 dead and 6,000 wounded, with the remainder captured. Dien Bien Phu ended the First Indochina War not because it destroyed the French military capacity to continue fighting. France had more troops in Indochina than the garrison that surrendered, and the Viet Minh had taken very heavy casualties, but because it destroyed the French political will to do so. The government in Paris that had been prosecuting the war fell. The new government under Pierre Mendès France came to power with a promise to end the war within 30 days. The Geneva Conference, which had been proceeding in parallel with the siege, now had the decisive fact it needed to produce an agreement. The war that had begun in December 1946 was over. What replaced it was an agreement that was supposed to produce peace and instead produce the conditions for a second war, an agreement made by great powers about a small country's future, signed with the careful diplomatic language of people who have decided to solve their immediate problem and let the next problem wait. The waiting, it turned out, was brief. Chapter 8: The Peace That Wasn't. The Geneva Conference of 1954 was one of those diplomatic gatherings where the formal outcome and the actual outcome diverged so completely that the document produced became less a settlement than a deferred argument. The conference had been convened to address two separate Asian conflicts simultaneously, Korea and Indochina, and the Indochina portion of it proceeded under the shadow of Dien Bien Phu, whose fall on May 7 arrived in the middle of the negotiations and clarified for everyone present the balance of military reality that the diplomacy would have to accommodate. The major powers at the table were France, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the state of Vietnam backed by the United States, China, the Soviet Union, and Britain. The United States sat at the table but made clear from the beginning that it did not intend to be bound by whatever emerged from it. The agreement that eventually took shape in late July 1954 rested on a temporary military demarcation line at the 17th parallel, a line running roughly across the narrowest point of Vietnam, dividing the country into a northern zone administered by the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and a southern zone administered by the French-backed state of Vietnam. The word temporary was not decorative. The final declaration of the Geneva Conference was explicit. The demarcation line was not a political boundary, not an international border, not a permanent division of the country. It was a temporary ceasefire line, to be dissolved by nationwide elections scheduled for July 1956, elections that would reunify the country under whichever government the Vietnamese people chose. The elections were the hinge on which everything else turned, and they never happened. He accepted the Geneva Accords with the resigned calculation of someone who understood that the Soviet Union and China, both of which had pressed the DRV delegation to accept the agreement, had their own reasons for wanting a settlement that did not include Vietnamese communist enthusiasm. China had just finished a war on the Korean Peninsula and had no interest in a situation on its southern border that might draw American military intervention. The Soviet Union, under the new post-Stalin leadership, was pursuing a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West that made a prolonged revolutionary war in Southeast Asia inconvenient. Both great power patrons wanted the fighting to stop, and their leverage over the DRV's position at Geneva was real enough that the DRV accepted terms that its military situation, Dien Bien Phu, had just fallen. The Viet Minh controlled large portions of the country, did not strictly require. The DRV delegation accepted the 17th parallel in the understanding that the 1956 elections would produce reunification. The calculation was straightforward and was shared by virtually every outside observer who assessed it honestly. Ho Chi Minh was the most recognized and respected political figure in Vietnam, North and South. An election conducted across the whole country in 1956 would almost certainly produce a victory for the DRV or for a coalition it dominated. The Eisenhower administration's own internal assessments reached the same conclusion, and those assessments were part of the reason the United States did not sign the final declaration. The movement of populations in the months following Geneva was itself a measure of the political complexity the agreement had papered over. Approximately 800,000 Vietnamese moved from north to south, the largest single component being Catholic communities from the Red River Delta, who had reason, given the DRV's communist character, to fear what Northern administration would mean for their religious institutions and their social position. American naval vessels participated in the evacuation, an operation called Passage to Freedom, and the Catholic refugees who arrived in the South became one of the social foundations of the government that Ngo Dinh Diem was constructing. Moving in the opposite direction were approximately 90,000 Southern Viet Minh cadres and their families, regrouping to the north as the agreement required, leaving behind, and this was a deliberate decision by the DRV leadership, a network of cadres who remained in place, buried in the villages and communities of the South, waiting for the 1956 elections or for whatever came after them. Ngo Dinh Diem arrived in Saigon in the summer of 1954 as the Prime Minister of the state of Vietnam, a position he had been maneuvered into through a combination of American backing and the endorsement of Emperor Bao Dai, who was by then conducting his nominal duties from a villa on the French Riviera. Diem was a man of genuinely complex character, whose historical reputation has been so thoroughly shaped by the manner of his end that the earlier substance of him is difficult to recover. He was a Catholic from a Mandarin family. His brother was a bishop who had spent years in self-imposed exile rather than collaborate with either the French or the Japanese or the Viet Minh. He had lived at a Maryknoll seminary in Lakewood, New Jersey for 2 years, where he had cultivated relationships with American Catholic figures, including Cardinal Francis Spellman and the young senator from Massachusetts, John Kennedy. He was austere, incorruptible in the financial sense, genuinely devout, and possessed of a political imagination that was formed entirely within the Confucian Mandarin tradition, a tradition that understood governance as the exercise of virtuous authority from above, not as the cultivation of popular legitimacy from below. The state he inherited barely existed in any functional sense. The southern zone had no coherent administrative structure, no reliable military, no established tax base, and no clear social foundation beyond the Catholic refugee communities and the urban middle class of Saigon, which was small and politically fractured. The rural population of the South, the millions of rice farmers in the Mekong Delta and the Central Highlands, had been living in many areas under Viet Minh administration for years, and their relationship to any Saigon government was at best neutral and in many areas actively skeptical. Diem set about constructing a state by the methods available to him: American aid, which arrived in substantial quantities, and political consolidation, which he pursued with a thoroughness that his American backers periodically found uncomfortable, but consistently supported. By 1955, he had moved against the Hoa Hao and Cao Dai religious sects that maintained their own armed forces in the Mekong Delta, the Binh Shuyen criminal organization that controlled Saigon's police and its considerable commercial interests, and the remnants of French political influence in the South. A referendum in October 1955, conducted with a fraud so transparent that even sympathetic observers found it embarrassing. Diem received 98% of the vote in some provinces, formally deposed Bao Dai, and established the Republic of Vietnam with Diem as president. The Americans accepted the result. The state existed nominally. The question of whether it could survive without continuous external support was one that the next decade would answer. The 1956 elections did not happen. Diem refused to participate in the all-Vietnam consultations that the Geneva Final Declaration called for, and the Eisenhower administration supported his refusal. The stated justification was that free elections could not be conducted in the Communist North, which was accurate in the sense that the DRV would not have permitted a genuinely open electoral competition. The unstated calculation was the one that Eisenhower's own advisors had made and committed to paper. Ho Chi Minh would win. The elections were not held because the side that would have lost them had the power to prevent them and the backing of the United States to do so without diplomatic consequence. In Hanoi, the response to the failure of the elections was a period of genuine strategic debate within the DRV leadership. He had accepted Geneva on the premise that the elections would happen. The premise had proved false. The question before the leadership was what to do about it, whether to resume armed struggle in the South immediately, whether to continue building the northern state and wait for a better moment, or whether some combination of political and military pressure could force a different outcome without the full cost of renewed war. The debate was not resolved quickly, and the resolution that emerged, a gradual escalation of support for the Southern resistance, beginning with political organizing and moving toward armed struggle as conditions developed, reflected the genuine complexity of the situation rather than a simple decision to go back to war. The Southern cadres who had stayed in place after Geneva, the network deliberately left behind in the villages and districts of the South, had been surviving under conditions of increasing pressure. Diem's government, advised by Michigan State University professors who were also, in some cases, CIA assets, developed a systematic program of identifying and eliminating communist cadres throughout the South. The program had real operational effect. Hundreds of Southern cadres were arrested, imprisoned, or killed in the mid-1950s, and the network that had been left in place after Geneva was significantly degraded. The cadres who survived, watching their colleagues disappear and receiving no effective support or authorization from Hanoi to defend themselves, sent increasingly urgent messages north requesting permission to resume armed struggle. He listened to these reports with the attention of someone who had been managing the relationship between political strategy and military necessity for 20 years, and who understood that the timing of resuming armed struggle was as important as the decision to resume it. Too early, and the political ground in the South was not prepared. The population had not yet fully experienced what Diem's government meant for their daily lives. Too late, and the Southern network would be destroyed before it could be rebuilt. The decision that emerged from the DRV leadership in the late 1950s, ratified in the party's resolution of 1959, was that the time had come and that the instrument for the next phase would be a Southern-based insurgency operating under Northern direction but presenting itself as an indigenous Southern movement. The agreement that was supposed to end the First War had instead designed the second one. The demarcation line at the 17th parallel, meant to be temporary, had hardened into the boundary between two incompatible political projects, one backed by the United States, one backed by the Communist North, that could not coexist indefinitely, and that both sides knew could not coexist indefinitely. The great powers that had convened at Geneva had solved their immediate problem and produced a longer one, as great powers at conference tables have a recurring tendency to do. What came next was not sudden. It built slowly through the late 1950s and early 1960s, accumulating through assassinations and arrests and village meetings and arms caches buried in rice paddies, through the decisions of men in Hanoi and Washington who were both, in different ways, inheriting a situation they had not quite made and could not quite control. The fire in the South was catching, and the man who had been planning this since the caves of Pac Bo was watching it from Hanoi, older now, his health not reliable, but still present at the center of an organization that had been working toward this moment for 30 years. The question was no longer whether the South would burn. The question was how hot it would get, and who would come to put it out, and what it would cost them when they discovered that the fire had been designed specifically to outlast anyone who tried. Chapter 9: The Southern Fire. The instrument Diem reached for when the Southern resistance began organizing was law. In May 1959, his government promulgated Ordinance 1059, which established special military tribunals empowered to try, convict, and execute anyone suspected of communist activity, with proceedings that could be completed in a matter of days and verdicts from which there was no appeal. The tribunals traveled. They moved through the provinces with their own security details and their own guillotines, conducting hearings in district capitals and market towns, rendering sentences that were carried out immediately and publicly. The guillotine as an instrument of colonial message sending had appeared before in this chronicle, in Vinh in 1931, and its reappearance in the South in 1959 under a nominally independent Vietnamese government backed by the United States carried a historical resonance that was not lost on the Vietnamese communities through which the tribunals passed. The immediate effect of 1059 was the acceleration of exactly the process it was intended to stop. The Southern cadres who had been surviving by staying quiet, maintaining their networks, avoiding action that would draw attention, now faced arrest and execution whether they acted or not. The distinction between political organizing and armed resistance, which the DRV leadership had been trying to maintain while the strategic debate in Hanoi resolved itself, collapsed under the pressure of a law that made the distinction irrelevant. Men who might have continued as political organizers for several more years became fighters because the alternative was the tribunal. Villages that had been neutral or cautiously sympathetic to the government turned against it as the tribunals moved through and took people they knew. The machinery designed to eliminate the insurgency was manufacturing the conditions for its expansion. The National Liberation Front was formally established in December 1960 at a congress held somewhere in the jungles of Tây Ninh province near the Cambodian border. The NLF presented itself as an independent southern movement, a broad coalition of groups opposed to the Diem government, drawing on the same organizational logic that Ho had used when founding the Viet Minh in 1941, subordinating the communist core to a nationalist framing that could appeal across ideological lines. The American government and the Diem administration called it the Viet Cong, Vietnamese Communists, a label intended to delegitimize it by emphasizing its ideological character over its nationalist one. The label stuck in American usage and obscured, for years, the genuine complexity of what the NLF actually represented, a movement with a communist leadership and a genuinely diverse membership, drawing fighters and supporters from communities whose primary grievance was not ideological but immediate: land, taxation, the tribunals, the strategic hamlets. The Strategic Hamlet Program was the American-advised answer to the NLF's growing rural presence. Its theory was population control. If the rural population could be concentrated in fortified villages, hamlets surrounded by ditches and bamboo fences, with entry and exit controlled, then the NLF's ability to recruit, to collect food and supplies, and to move through the countryside would be systematically degraded. By 1963, approximately 8,600 strategic hamlets had been constructed or were under construction across South Vietnam, representing one of the largest forced population relocation programs in Southeast Asian history. Families were moved from land their ancestors had farmed for generations into compounds they had not chosen, surrounded by fencing that was presented as protection and experienced as confinement. The program succeeded in concentrating the population and failed in everything else. The hamlets were regularly infiltrated. The NLF collected its taxes and its recruits from inside them, and the resentment generated by the relocations produced more fighters than the program's security perimeter ever kept out. Ngo Dinh Diem governed through his family in a way that concentrated power so thoroughly that the state and the Ngo family became, in practice, indistinguishable. His brother Ngo Dinh Hue ran the secret police and the Can Lao Party, the regime's internal security and political organization, with a combination of genuine intelligence and a paranoia that deepened as the insurgency grew. Ngu's wife, known in the American press as Madame Ngu, served as the regime's most visible public voice, a role she performed with a combative confidence that her husband's more shadowy position did not permit him. The family character of the regime was not incidental to its failures. It meant that the feedback mechanisms through which a government learns that its policies are not working were systematically blocked, because the people delivering bad news to Diem were delivering it to a man whose primary political circle was his brother's, and whose response to criticism was increasingly to treat it as evidence of communist infiltration rather than legitimate information. The Buddhist crisis of 1963 was the point at which the regime's internal contradictions became visible to the world in a form that could not be managed. In May of that year, government forces in Hue fired on crowds celebrating the Buddha's birthday, a gathering that had been prohibited under a regulation banning the public display of Buddhist flags, a regulation not enforced with comparable vigor against Catholic flags. 9 people died. The incident was not isolated. It was the most visible expression of a pattern of discrimination against the Buddhist majority that had been building for years under a government whose Catholic leadership made no serious effort to conceal its religious favoritism. Protests spread. Buddhist monks began a campaign of civil disobedience that drew international press attention with a speed the regime had not anticipated and could not control. On the morning of June 11, 1963, at an intersection in Saigon, a 66-year-old monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down in the road in the lotus position. Other monks poured gasoline over him. He struck a match. He burned to death without moving, without making a sound, in front of a crowd that included journalists and photographers. The photograph taken by Malcolm Brown appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the world the following morning. A man on fire, completely still, surrounded by a street full of people watching. It is one of the most widely reproduced photographs of the 20th century, and its effect on international opinion about the Diem government was immediate and severe. Madame Ngu's response to the photograph and to the protests that followed it became, in its own way, as consequential as the image itself. She referred to the immolations. There were subsequent ones, as other monks followed Thich Quang Duc's example, as barbecues. She offered to provide the matches for the next one. She said she would clap her hands at the spectacle. The statements were made to foreign journalists and reported with the accuracy they deserved. They constitute a compressed expression of the distance between the Diem government and the population it was claiming to govern. Not just the Buddhist majority, but anyone watching from outside who might have been persuaded that this was a government worth supporting as a defense against communism. The statements accomplished, in a few sentences, what months of NLF propaganda had not managed to achieve as efficiently. They made the regime's character visible in terms that required no interpretation. The coup that killed Diem came on November 1, 1963. It was organized by a group of South Vietnamese generals who had been in contact with American officials, and the American role in it is one of those historical questions where the documentary record is clear enough to establish complicity and ambiguous enough to permit argument about its precise degree. The Kennedy administration had withdrawn the signal of support that had previously deterred coup attempts. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge had made clear to the plotting generals that the United States would not intervene to save the regime, and when the generals moved, American intervention to stop them was not forthcoming. Diem and New were captured in a Catholic church in the Colon district of Saigon, having fled the presidential palace through a tunnel during the night. They were put in an armored personnel carrier. They arrived at military headquarters dead, shot at close range with their hands tied behind their backs. The coup's organizers claimed they had committed suicide, a claim that the physical evidence did not support. Kennedy was assassinated 3 weeks later. Lyndon Johnson inherited a South Vietnam that had just killed its president, a military situation that was deteriorating in the countryside regardless of what the official reporting said, and an American commitment that had been building since 1954 through successive administrations to a point where the options available were all costly and none were clean. The Gulf of Tonkin incident of August 1964 provided the legal mechanism for what followed. On August 7th, North Vietnamese torpedo boats attacked the USS Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin. A genuine engagement conducted in waters where the Maddox had been supporting South Vietnamese commando operations against the North Vietnamese coast. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Maddox and a second destroyer reported a second attack. The second attack almost certainly did not happen. The reports came from confused radar readings during a stormy night, and the officers on the scene expressed significant doubt about what they had actually detected. Johnson received the reports, chose to treat them as confirmed, and within hours was asking Congress for authorization to use military force in Southeast Asia. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the Senate with 2 dissenting votes and the House unanimously. It was the legal basis for a war that Congress had not formally declared and would not formally declare for the duration of its existence. The escalation that followed moved with a speed that its architects later described in the memoirs and retrospective analyses they produced in the decades after, with varying degrees of self-awareness about what they had understood at the time and what they had declined to understand. The first American combat troops arrived in March 1965, Marines landing at Da Nang, photographed on the beach by press cameras, greeted by Vietnamese girls with flower garlands. By the end of 1965, there were approximately 185,000 American troops in South Vietnam. By the end of 1966, there were 385,000. The bombing campaign against North Vietnam, Operation Rolling Thunder, had been running since March 1965, dropping tonnages that eventually exceeded the total American ordnance dropped in the entire Second World War across all theaters. He watched the escalation from Hanoi with the accumulated intelligence of someone who had been studying how empires behave since he stood in a rented suit outside the Versailles Conference in 1919. He had been waiting for the Americans specifically since at least 1945, when the OSS agents at Pac Bo had seemed briefly like potential allies rather than future adversaries. He understood American domestic politics well enough to know that a democracy fighting an unpopular war in a distant country had a clock running against it that no military escalation could stop, that the question was not whether American public opinion would eventually turn, but when and what the cost would be in the intervening years. The strategy he had articulated within the DRV leadership was not to defeat the American military in the field, which was not possible, but to make the cost of continuing the war higher than the cost of ending it, and to sustain that calculation long enough for the American political system to do what democratic political systems do when wars stop making sense to the people paying for them. The instrument for sustaining that calculation was being built, even as the American troop numbers climbed through the mountains and jungles on the western edge of Indochina. It was not a road. It was not a single route. It was a system, and understanding it is essential to understanding why the escalation that looked in Washington's briefing rooms like a strategy for winning was, in the mountains of the Truong Son Range, something closer to a demonstration of exactly the problem it was trying to solve. Chapter 10: The Trail. The 559th Transportation Group was established in May 1959 with approximately 500 men, a directive from the DRV Military Command, and the assignment of opening a supply route from the north into the south along the mountain spine of the Truong Son Range. The group's commander, General Vo Bam, was given the mission in terms that reflected the strategic moment. The Southern resistance needed weapons, medicines, and cadres, and the sea route was too exposed to interdiction, and the 17th parallel was too heavily watched, and the only viable path was through the mountains on the western border, through Laos, threading between the populated valleys and the peaks, staying in terrain that aircraft could not easily patrol, and that infantry could not easily follow. Vo Bam's men began cutting that path in the summer of 1959 with machetes and shovels, surveying routes through jungle that had no maps adequate to the task, losing men to falls and to the specific diseases that the Truong Son Range harbored in its lower elevations, malaria primarily, but also the infections that untreated cuts acquired in that humidity, and the scrub typhus that the mite populations of the forest floor transmitted with democratic indifference to military rank. The early trail was not impressive by any logistical standard. In its first year of operation, the 559th Group moved approximately 2,000 weapons south, rifles, ammunition, a small number of crew-served weapons, carried by porters on paths that were barely paths, through terrain that made every kilometer a negotiation between the route and the geography. The carrying capacity was limited by the human body's ability to sustain load over mountain terrain across multiple days, and the human body, even a young and fit one accustomed to physical labor, has absolute limits that no organizational discipline can suspend. A porter on the early trail could carry perhaps 30 kilograms across a mountain pass if the distance was short enough and the rest stations frequent enough and the food supply reliable enough, conditions that were met inconsistently in the first years of operation. What changed was investment and time. The DRV committed engineering resources to the trail on a scale that expanded steadily across the early 1960s and accelerated sharply after the American escalation of 1965 made the Southern supply problem urgent rather than merely important. Paths became tracks. Tracks were widened and surfaced where the terrain permitted. River crossings acquired underwater bridges, structures built just below the water surface, invisible from the air, traversable by trucks in low water, that could be rebuilt in hours if the occasional airstrike found and destroyed them. The trail developed redundancy, not a single route but a network of parallel and connecting paths, so that interdicting any one section diverted traffic to another section rather than stopping it. By the mid-1960s, the trail had grown from its original single corridor into a system covering approximately 16,000 kilometers of routes, including all branches and connectors, a figure that gives some sense of why the American bombing campaign against it, which was extensive and sustained and technically sophisticated, never succeeded in closing it. The bombing was not ineffective in the narrow tactical sense. It killed people and destroyed vehicles and cratered road surfaces and dropped bridges and detonated supply caches and made movement along certain sections at certain times genuinely dangerous. Between 1964 and 1973, American aircraft dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on the trail network in Laos alone, a bombing campaign conducted largely in secret from the American public because Laos was officially neutral and the trail ran through Laotian territory, which made the bombing a violation of Laotian sovereignty that required deniability. The tonnage was real. The craters were real. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong dead along the trail were real, and their numbers were significant. None of it closed the trail, because the trail was not a thing that could be closed. It was a system that responded to damage by regenerating, and the regeneration was performed by a labor force that the DRV mobilized in quantities the American military planning had not adequately modeled. The labor force was the key, and it is the element of the trail that conventional military analysis most consistently underweights. At peak operation, the trail employed somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 people in various capacities: engineers who maintained and improved the road surfaces, anti-aircraft crews who manned the gun positions along the route, medical personnel who staffed the rest stations and field hospitals, logistics personnel who managed the supply depots, and the drivers who operated the Soviet and Chinese trucks that moved the bulk of the supplies once the routes were developed enough to carry wheeled vehicles. Most of these people were not soldiers in any conventional sense. Many of them were young women. The historical record of the trail is full of women's brigades maintaining road sections, filling craters, rebuilding bridges, doing the physical labor of keeping the system functional under conditions of intermittent bombing. Their casualty rates were significant. Their work was the reason the system continued. The tunnel systems of Ho Chi represented the trail's southern terminus, expressed in vertical rather than horizontal form. Ho Chi district sits northwest of Saigon, and beneath its red laterite soil, over 2 decades of digging beginning in the late 1940s, the Viet Minh and later the NLF had constructed an underground city, approximately 250 kilometers of tunnels at full development, running on 3 levels, the deepest level approximately 9 meters below the surface. The tunnels contained hospitals, weapons workshops, command centers, living quarters, kitchens with ventilation systems designed to disperse cooking smoke laterally so it emerged from the surface at a distance from the actual tunnel entrance. Above these tunnels, For significant periods of the war, sat American military bases, including the headquarters of the 25th Infantry Division at Ho Chi Base Camp, which occupied ground beneath which NLF tunnels ran at depths the base's construction had not detected. The relationship between the surface war and the subsurface war at Ho Chi is one of those facts about the Vietnam conflict that, when encountered directly, produces a quality of disorientation that ordinary military history rarely generates. American soldiers ate in mess halls built above tunnels where NLF fighters were sleeping. American officers planned operations in command centers whose floors were, in some cases, the ceilings of NLF storage areas. The tunnel entrances were concealed with a thoroughness that reflected decades of practice. A trapdoor covered with dirt and leaves, barely large enough for a person to slip through, that could be closed from inside in seconds. American units searching for tunnel entrances found them occasionally, and the soldiers sent down to investigate them, called tunnel rats, a designation they acquired with the dark humor that soldiers apply to assignments that everyone understands are genuinely dangerous, encountered an underground architecture built by people who had been living in it and defending it for years, and who had advantages in that environment that all the American firepower above ground could not neutralize. The trail and the tunnels together constituted a strategic argument expressed in physical infrastructure. The argument was that the Vietnamese Communist military could sustain a presence anywhere in the country, could supply that presence across any terrain and under any bombing campaign the Americans could mount, and could absorb the casualties that sustaining that presence required at a rate that the American political system could not match. This was not a claim about military superiority. The DRV and the NLF never claimed military superiority against the American forces. The body counts, which the American military tracked with the obsessive precision of an institution that had confused a metric for a strategy, generally ran in the Americans' favor in individual engagements. The claim was about something else, about the relationship between military cost and political will, about the different ways in which a democracy and a revolutionary movement calculate the price of continuing a war. Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense who had done more than anyone except Lyndon Johnson to design the American escalation, understood this problem with increasing clarity across the mid-1960s and found himself unable to act on his understanding within the political and institutional structure he occupied. His internal memoranda from 1966 and 1967, documents that were not public at the time, but that became available in the Pentagon Papers and in his own later writings, show a man who had concluded that the war as currently being fought could not be won, that the bombing was not working in its stated objectives, that the search and destroy operations were generating casualties without generating the political and military attrition they were designed to produce. He presented these conclusions to Johnson with the careful qualification of a man who knew his audience, and Johnson received them with the impatience of a president who had staked his domestic political legacy on a war he could not publicly lose and could not evidently win. The trail kept moving. Through the monsoon seasons, when the rains turned the mountain paths to mud and the rivers rose to levels that submerged the underwater bridges, and the convoys had to wait. Through the dry seasons when the paths hardened and the American air strikes intensified because the visibility improved. Through the years when the bombing was heaviest, and the engineers repaired the roads behind the strikes with a speed that American pilots, who could photograph the damage the morning after and the repairs the following morning, found difficult to process within the framework of an adversary that was supposed to be running out of capacity. The trail ran because there were always more people to run it, because the organization behind it treated its own casualties as a cost of operation rather than as evidence that the operation was failing, and because the destination it was supplying, the Southern insurgency, the NLF's network of fighters and supporters in the villages and jungles of South Vietnam, continued to exist and to fight and to require the supplies that only the trail could deliver. By 1967, the trail was moving an estimated 10,000 tons of supplies per month into the South at peak capacity. The American bombing was killing an estimated 1 North Vietnamese or Viet Cong worker or soldier for every 40 tons of bombs dropped, a ratio that the analysts who calculated it understood was not producing the attrition that justified the campaign's cost in aircraft, ordnance, and American aircrew lives. The war's metrics had become a kind of institutional hallucination, a set of numbers that were accurate in their own terms and misleading about everything that mattered. The supplies moving down the trail in the autumn and winter of 1967 included, among the routine shipments of rice and ammunition and medicines, the weapons and personnel for something larger than anything the trail had yet supported, a coordinated operation of a scale that would require simultaneous attacks across the entire country, timed to a specific date, designed not to hold territory, but to communicate something that months of jungle fighting had failed to communicate clearly enough. The date chosen was the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. The operation had been in planning for months, and what it was intended to say to the South Vietnamese population, to the American public, to Lyndon Johnson, was that the war the American government had been describing to its people bore no relationship to the war that was actually being fought. Chapter 11: The Offensive and the Broadcast. January 30, 1968 was the first day of Tet, the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, the most important holiday in the Vietnamese calendar, a time when families gathered and firecrackers were set off, and the war, by informal convention that had held across several previous Tet periods, paused. The pause had been announced again for 1968. A ceasefire of 36 hours had been declared. South Vietnamese soldiers had been granted leave. The streets of Saigon and Hue and Da Nang and dozens of smaller cities were full of civilian movement, holiday traffic, the ordinary chaos of a major festival in a country at war, but not, on that particular night, actively fighting. At approximately 3 in the morning, coordinated attacks began across more than 100 cities and towns simultaneously. The scale of the coordination was, by any military measure, extraordinary. NLF and North Vietnamese units had been moving into position for weeks, sometimes concealing weapons in flour carts and vegetable trucks, making routine deliveries into urban areas, sometimes moving through tunnel systems that connected to city buildings, sometimes simply walking into cities in civilian clothes and waiting. The planning had required months and had been conducted with a secrecy that the American and South Vietnamese intelligence services had failed to penetrate at the operational level. There had been indications, fragments of signals intelligence, and captured documents that suggested something large was coming, but the indicators had been processed through an institutional framework that was not prepared to imagine an attack of this scope and had discounted what it could not fit into its existing model of enemy capability. In Saigon, an NLF sapper team breached the wall of the United States Embassy compound at approximately 2:45 in the morning. The embassy had been completed 2 years earlier at a cost of $2.5 million, designed with security features that were intended to make it impregnable to exactly this kind of attack. 19 sappers got through the outer wall. They did not get into the main chancery building. The Marine Guards held the entrance. The sappers were killed or wounded in the courtyard over the following hours, and by early morning the compound had been secured. The battle for the embassy lasted approximately 6 hours and resulted in the deaths of all 19 attackers and 5 American defenders. It was, in military terms, a failed attack. The embassy was not captured. No flag was raised. No hostages were taken. The political and symbolic objectives of seizing the American mission in Saigon, if those were in fact the objectives, were not achieved. By the operational logic of a military campaign, the embassy attack was a minor engagement that ended in the attacker's defeat. The television cameras arrived before it was over. The footage of the battle for the embassy compound ran on American morning news broadcasts while the fighting was still continuing. Images of a firefight inside the walls of the American embassy in Saigon, bodies in the courtyard, a Marine with a pistol moving through the garden of a building that was supposed to represent the secure center of American power in Vietnam. The images were accurate. They showed what was actually happening. What they communicated to an American audience watching over breakfast was something that no military assessment, no body count, no progress briefing from General Westmoreland had prepared them to receive. That the war that was being won, that the enemy was running out of men and materials and will, that the light at the end of the tunnel was genuine, that war and this war were not the same thing. Westmoreland had made the tunnel remark in November 1967 in a speech to the National Press Club in Washington that was intended to reassure an American public whose confidence in the war's progress was already fraying. He had said, with the measured optimism of a commander who believed his own metrics, that the enemy's hopes were bankrupt and that the end was coming into view. The speech had been reported and noted and had provided, for 2 months, a framework of official confidence that the Tet Offensive dissolved in a single morning. The gap between what Westmoreland had said and what the television cameras showed was not a gap that could be explained away by pointing to the military failure of the attacks. The explanation was accurate and was made repeatedly by military spokesmen who were correct that Tet had not achieved its tactical objectives. The problem was that the explanation required the American public to process the attacks as evidence of American success, and the American public watching the embassy courtyard was not processing them that way. The Battle of Hue was the Tet Offensive's most consequential single engagement, and it lasted 25 days. Hue was Vietnam's ancient imperial capital, the city of the Nguyen dynasty's citadel and its temples, and its old walled inner city, and NLF and North Vietnamese forces captured most of it in the first hours of the offensive and held it against American and South Vietnamese counterattack for nearly a month of close urban combat that destroyed large portions of the city in the process of retaking it. The fighting at Hue was of a different character than most of the war's engagements, not the jungle ambushes and search and destroy sweeps that had defined much of the previous 3 years, but street by street, building by building combat in an urban environment, with the specific brutality that urban warfare generates when the buildings people live in become the terrain soldiers fight through. Casualties on all sides were high. The ancient citadel was damaged. Mass graves were later discovered containing the bodies of civilians and captured soldiers executed by the NLF during their occupation, a fact that the American government documented and publicized, and that added a layer of moral complexity to the offensive's legacy that the anti-war movement found difficult to incorporate into its narrative. The Tet Offensive failed to hold any of its urban objectives. By the end of February, NLF and North Vietnamese forces had been expelled from every city they had entered, at enormous cost. American estimates of enemy dead ran to 45,000 for the offensive's main phase, though these figures carry the uncertainty of all Vietnam-era body counts. The NLF's southern infrastructure, the network of cadres and supporters that had been built across a decade of patient organizing, was significantly degraded by the losses. Fighters who had been embedded in urban populations for years were exposed and killed during the offensive in numbers that took years to replace. Giap later acknowledged that the offensive's military costs were higher than anticipated, and that the political results in the South, the popular uprising against the Saigon government that the offensive had been designed to trigger, did not materialize in the way the planners had hoped. None of this changed what had happened to American public opinion. On the evening of February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, whose measured and authoritative delivery had made him the most trusted voice in American broadcast journalism, a position he occupied with a professional self-consciousness that usually kept him from editorializing, delivered a special report on the Tet Offensive that ended with 2 minutes of direct editorial commentary. He had traveled to Vietnam himself after the offensive began, had seen the fighting at Hue, had spoken to soldiers and commanders and Vietnamese civilians, and had come back with a conclusion that he stated plainly: the war was a stalemate. The optimistic official assessments were not supported by the evidence, and the only rational way out was negotiation. He said it carefully, in the measured cadences of someone who understood the weight of what he was saying, and he said it on the most watched news broadcast in the country. Lyndon Johnson watched the broadcast. The account of what he said afterward exists in several versions, attributed by different sources with different degrees of reliability, but the versions converge on the same essential expression, that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. Whether the exact words are precisely accurate matters less than the underlying reality they described, which was accurate, that the gap between the official narrative of the war and what Americans could see had become too wide to manage, and that the person whose professional function was to tell Americans what was true had looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion that the administration could not reverse by arguing with it. Robert McNamara had already submitted his resignation, which Johnson accepted in late February, replacing him with Clark Clifford, who had been a consistent supporter of the war and who arrived at the Pentagon and began reading the classified assessments, and within weeks had reached conclusions about the war's trajectory that were not substantially different from McNamara's. The institutions were producing the same answer from different personnel, which is what institutions do when the underlying reality has become undeniable even to people committed to denying it. Clifford became, within months of his appointment, one of the voices advising Johnson that the current course was not sustainable. On March 31st, 1968, Johnson addressed the nation on television. He announced a partial halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and the opening of peace negotiations. He announced that he would not seek and would not accept the nomination of his party for another term as president. He was a large man who had spent his political life in the controlled aggression of congressional deal-making and who, in that broadcast, looked like someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time and had decided to put it down. The announcement was not a surprise to everyone in his circle. The internal debate had been running for weeks, but its public delivery carried a weight that the political analysis of it tends to underemphasize. He had won the largest electoral landslide in modern American history in 1964 and was withdrawing from the 1968 race rather than face a primary challenge from within his own party over a war that his predecessor had started and that he had escalated with the full confidence of a man who believed American power was equal to any problem it was directed at. Peace talks opened in Paris in May 1968, with the American delegation led initially by Averell Harriman and the North Vietnamese delegation led by Xuan Thuy. The talks proceeded with the glacial pace of negotiations conducted between parties with incompatible objectives in a forum neither side fully trusted, while the war continued, while American aircraft continued bombing, while NLF and North Vietnamese forces continued fighting, while American and Vietnamese soldiers continued dying at rates that the existence of negotiations in a Paris conference room did nothing to reduce. The talks were the war's diplomatic shadow, moving alongside it without resolve it, producing language that both sides could describe to their constituencies as progress, while neither side made the concessions that an actual settlement required. He followed the Paris talks from Hanoi with the attention they deserved and the detachment of someone who understood that the talks' function at this stage was to manage the American withdrawal rather than to negotiate the peace. The withdrawal was coming. Johnson's announcement had made it a question of when rather than whether, and the when depended on American domestic politics, on who won the 1968 election, on what that person believed about the war and what they were willing to do about it, on how the American political system resolved the contradiction between the desire to leave and the desire not to be seen as having lost. What the American political system produced in November 1968 was Richard Nixon, who had run on a promise of a secret plan to end the war and who arrived in office with a strategy that combined the gradual withdrawal of American ground troops, Vietnamization, the transfer of the ground war's burden to South Vietnamese forces, with an expansion of the air war and a willingness to extend military operations into Cambodia and Laos that his predecessor had declined. The combination was internally coherent as a political strategy for managing American disengagement while maintaining the appearance of strategic seriousness. Whether it was coherent as a military strategy for producing a stable South Vietnam was a different question, and the answer to it was being worked out, slowly and expensively, in the years that followed. He did not live to see those years resolve themselves. His health, which had been declining since the early 1960s, was failing by 1968 in ways that the DRV leadership managed carefully and did not publicize. He continued to work, to receive visitors, to participate in the political discussions of the leadership. But the man who had crossed the border into Vietnam on foot in 1941 was now 78 years old and carrying the accumulated physical cost of a life that had included imprisonment, malaria, dysentery, years of inadequate nutrition, and the chronic stress of leading a revolutionary movement for 5 decades. He had written his will in 1965 and had been revising it since, adding and removing passages as the war developed and as his own sense of what he wanted to say at the end shifted. The conclusion that his life had been building toward was not yet complete. The war would continue for 7 more years after him, through phases that he had anticipated and phases that would have surprised him, to an ending that he had planned for without being certain he would see. Whether the ending matched what he had imagined and what was left when the last helicopter lifted from the embassy roof is where the chronicle turns for its final movement. Chapter 12: The Long Conclusion. He died on September 2nd, 1969. The date was Vietnamese National Day, the anniversary of the declaration he had read in Ba Dinh Square 24 years earlier, the day he had asked the crowd whether they could hear him, and they had answered yes. Whether the coincidence was meaningful in any causal sense is a question the historical record cannot answer. His health had been deteriorating for months, and the specific timing of a death from cardiac and respiratory failure is not something a person controls with precision. What can be said is that he had hoped to live to see reunification, had said so explicitly in the successive drafts of his will, and that he died with the war in its 6th year and no end in sight, in a country that was still divided at the 17th parallel that Geneva had drawn 15 years earlier as a temporary line. The will he left behind had been drafted first in May 1965 on his 75th birthday, revised in 1968, and again in 1969 as his condition worsened. The final version expressed, in the spare and careful language he had always preferred over oratory, a set of wishes for the country and the party and the people that he had spent his life organizing toward a future he would not see. He asked that his body be cremated, a request that the party leadership did not honor, embalming him instead and placing him in a mausoleum in Ba Dinh Square, visible and permanent, which was precisely the kind of monument he had specifically asked not to be given. The gap between what he requested and what the party did with him after his death is one of those small historical ironies that contains, compressed within it, the larger tension between the man and the institution he built, between someone who had always understood power as instrumental and an organization that needed its founder to be a symbol. The leadership that continued the war after his death was not the leadership that had built the movement with him. Le Duan, the party's first secretary, had been the dominant figure in the DRV's strategic direction since the early 1960s, and his approach to the war was harder and less patient than Ho's, less concerned with the international optics of Vietnamese communist policy, more willing to sustain casualties at rates that the older leadership had considered carefully before accepting. Le Duan had pushed for the Tet Offensive against the reservations of some senior figures, had pressed for earlier and more aggressive military action in the South across the decade, and had, in the internal debates of the DRP leadership, consistently represented the position that the military path was the primary one, and that diplomatic and political maneuvering were its auxiliaries rather than its equals. Nixon's strategy of Vietnamization proceeded through 1969 and 1970 with the logic of an administration that needed to reduce American casualties, which were running at roughly 500 per week when Nixon took office, without producing the visible collapse that would constitute losing. American troop levels declined. South Vietnamese forces took on more of the ground combat. The air war intensified to compensate for the reduction in ground forces, and in April 1970, Nixon extended it dramatically by ordering the invasion of Cambodia. The operation aimed at destroying the NLF and North Vietnamese base areas and supply depots that had been operating in Cambodian territory along the border, the sanctuaries that had been a chronic problem for American military planners and that had previously been off limits to ground operations because Cambodia was officially neutral. The Cambodia invasion produced in the United States the most severe domestic political crisis of the war to that point. Campus protests erupted across the country. At Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on student demonstrators on May 4, 1970, killing 4 and wounding 9. The killings produced a national student strike that closed hundreds of universities. The Senate voted to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The gap between the administration's description of the Cambodia operation as a limited incursion designed to shorten the war and the public's experience of a war that kept expanding into new countries was, by 1970, producing a political atmosphere in which the administration's credibility on Vietnam had been largely consumed. The Easter Offensive of March 1972 was the North Vietnamese military's largest conventional operation since Dien Bien Phu, 3 divisions crossing the demilitarized zone and striking south in a coordinated assault that, for several weeks, threatened to collapse the South Vietnamese military entirely. The offensive was eventually stopped at considerable cost by the combination of South Vietnamese ground resistance and American air power, which Nixon unleashed in full after the initial advances. The B-52 strikes that supported the defense of An Loc and the counterattack at Quang Tri represented American air power at the maximum scale it had been applied in the war, and they were effective in the tactical sense. The offensive was stopped. The territorial losses were largely recovered. They were also the demonstration, visible to anyone looking clearly at the situation, that South Vietnamese ground forces could hold their position only with American air support on a scale that the Vietnamization strategy was supposed to be making unnecessary. The Christmas bombings of December 1972, Operation Linebacker II, were the most concentrated application of American strategic air power in the war's history. For 12 days, B-52s struck Hanoi and Haiphong in waves, targeting rail yards, power plants, supply depots, airfields, and the infrastructure of the North Vietnamese war economy. The civilian casualties were significant. The damage to Hanoi's urban areas was visible and documented by journalists and foreign diplomats who were present. Nixon ordered the campaign after the Paris peace negotiations had stalled, and the stated objective was to force the North Vietnamese back to the table with the seriousness of purpose that the previous months of talks had not produced. Whether the bombing achieved this, or whether the talks resumed because both sides had arrived independently at a point where an agreement was more useful than continued fighting, is a question that the historical record supports different answers to depending on how the evidence is weighted. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. The agreement provided for a ceasefire in place, the withdrawal of American forces, the return of prisoners of war, and a political process for resolving the question of South Vietnam's future through negotiation between the Saigon government and the NLF. It did not require the withdrawal of North Vietnamese forces already in the South. It did not establish a mechanism with any realistic prospect of resolving the fundamental incompatibility between the two Vietnamese governments. It provided the framework within which the United States could complete its military withdrawal while describing the outcome as something other than defeat, and it provided the North Vietnamese with an American commitment to withdrawal that, once fulfilled, would leave the final question to be settled by Vietnamese forces without American military intervention. Kissinger and Le Duc Tho received the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating it. Le Duc Tho declined his on the grounds that peace had not actually been established in Vietnam. The observation was accurate. Nixon's resignation in August 1974, in the wake of the Watergate scandal, removed from office the president who had given South Vietnam private assurances that American air power would respond to North Vietnamese violations of the ceasefire. The assurances had been made without congressional authorization and could not be honored by a successor administration operating in the post-Watergate political environment in which Congress had already passed the War Powers Resolution limiting the president's ability to commit American forces without legislative approval and had been cutting military aid to South Vietnam since 1973. The Saigon government was not informed in any direct way that the private assurances Nixon had provided were no longer operative. It continued to operate on the assumption that American support would materialize when it was needed, an assumption that the political reality in Washington had made false without anyone in Saigon having been told clearly that this was so. The final North Vietnamese offensive began in January 1975 with probing attacks in Phu Quoc province, which fell to North Vietnamese forces in early January. The fall of a province was not, in itself, a strategic catastrophe. Provinces had changed hands before. What was strategically significant was the American response, which was none. No airstrikes, no emergency aid, no visible signal that the United States intended to honor the commitments that South Vietnamese leaders believed it had made. The North Vietnamese military command watched the American non-response to Phu Quoc and drew the obvious conclusion: the constraint that had limited their operations for a decade had been removed. The offensive accelerated in March. Ban Mi Thuot fell on March 11. The decision by South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thu to withdraw forces from the Central Highlands, an attempt to consolidate a defensible perimeter, turned into a rout as the withdrawal became a panicked retreat along roads clogged with soldiers and civilians under North Vietnamese artillery fire and air attack. Hue fell on March 25. Da Nang fell on March 29. The cities that had been the centers of American military presence in Vietnam, The places whose names had become familiar to American newspaper readers across a decade of war fell in sequence over a period of weeks, each fall accelerating the next as the South Vietnamese military's cohesion dissolved under the pressure of rapid defeat after years of being told that it was capable of standing on its own. Saigon in the first weeks of April 1975 was a city absorbing the approach of an ending that everyone present could see and almost no one could stop. The American embassy had begun evacuation procedures, burning documents, processing the Vietnamese employees and allies whose association with the American mission placed them at risk. The streets filled with the particular chaos of a city whose future had arrived faster than its institutions could process. People trying to get to the airport, trying to get to the embassy, trying to find a way out of a country whose government was visibly ceasing to exist. Ambassador Graham Martin, who had resisted the full-scale evacuation until the last possible moment out of concern for what its optics would communicate about American commitment, finally authorized the helicopter evacuation on the morning of April 29. The images from that morning, the helicopter on the roof of a building near the embassy, the lines of people waiting on the stairs, the final Marine helicopter lifting off from the embassy roof in the early hours of April 30, became the visual vocabulary through which the American experience of the Vietnam War was subsequently understood and argued about. They showed what they showed, an evacuation conducted under pressure in the final hours of a government that the United States had supported for 21 years and could not in the end save. On the morning of April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese forces moved through the outskirts of Saigon toward the center of the city. Tank 843 of the 203rd Tank Brigade led the column that approached the Reunification Palace, the building that had been the presidential palace of the Republic of Vietnam, the center of the government whose existence the United States had staked its credibility on sustaining. The tank breached the palace gates at approximately 11 in the morning. General Duong Van Minh, who had been president of South Vietnam for approximately 40 hours and who had accepted the position specifically because he was considered a figure with enough nationalist credibility to negotiate a surrender, was waiting inside. He surrendered. A soldier climbed to the palace roof and raised the flag of the Provisional Revolutionary Government. The time was approximately 11:30 in the morning. He had been dead for 5 years and 7 months. The country that existed on April 30th, 1975 was not quite the country he had imagined from Pak Bo Cave in 1941 or from his prison cell in Guangxi in 1943 or from the platform in Ba Dinh Square in 1945. 60 years of working toward a specific future never produces the future exactly as envisioned. The costs are higher than the vision accounted for. The institutions that emerge from the struggle carry the marks of what the struggle required, and the country that exists when the fighting stops is inhabited by people who have been shaped by the fighting in ways that the person who began it could not have foreseen. The war had cost Vietnam somewhere between 2 and 3 million dead across both conflicts in a country of less than 40 million people when the first war began. It had left the South's agricultural land contaminated with unexploded ordnance and defoliated by chemical herbicides that would affect the soil for decades. It had produced a generation that had known nothing but war and would spend the years that followed learning what peace required of people who had been organized for as long as they could remember around the question of survival. What had been achieved was real. The country was unified. The foreign armies were gone. The flag that went up over the reunification palace at 11:30 on April 30 flew over a Vietnam that was for the first time since 1858 not administered by a foreign power. The man who had stepped onto a French steamer in Saigon Harbor in 1911, carrying almost nothing, speaking to no one, already thinking about the distance between what his country was and what he intended to make it. That man had been right about the essential thing. The empire would eventually go. The question was only the cost of making it go, and the cost had been, as costs in these matters always are, higher than anyone at the beginning had been willing to calculate. The Trong Son Mountains that the trail had threaded through were still there, the jungle growing back over the bomb craters as jungles do, slowly and without judgment, returning the land to something older than the war. The rivers still ran to the sea. The rice paddies of the delta still flooded in the season when they were supposed to flood and receded when they were supposed to recede. The country that had existed before the French arrived in 1858 and that had persisted through everything that followed, through conquest and resistance and two great wars and the specific grinding suffering of a century of other people deciding what it was for. That country was still there, in the land itself, in the particular quality of the light over the South China Sea in the early morning, in the mountains of Nguyen where the chronicle began, older than any of the names given to it, continuing. The journey is complete. Rest well.